Chapter 20 of The Hand in the Dark. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Hand in the Dark by Arthur J. REES. Chapter 20. Colwyn spent a couple of hours that night reading the depositions he had obtained from Merrington, and next morning he studied them afresh with a concentration which the incessant hum of London traffic outside was powerless to disturb. He was well aware that a report was a poor substitute for original impressions, but in the typewritten document before him lay the facts of the Heredith case so far as they were known. It was a clear and colourless transcription of the narrative of the witnesses, set down with a painstaking regard for the value of departmental records, and chiefly valuable to Colwyn because it contained the expert evidence which sometimes reveals, with the pitiless accuracy of science, what human nature endeavours to hide. In the balance of the scales of justice, it is the ascertained truth which weighs heavier than faith, reason, or revealed religion. When he had finished his study of the depositions, he sat a while pondering over his own discoveries since he had been called into the case by the husband of the dead woman. These discoveries, due apparently to chance, invested the murder with a complexity which stimulated all the penetrative and analytical powers of his fine mind, because they brought with them the realization that he was face to face with one of those rare crimes where the solution has to be unravelled from a tangle of false circumstances, which, by their seeming plausibility, make the task of reaching the truth one of peculiar difficulty. As Colwyn sat motionless, with his chin resting on his hand, brooding over the sullen secretive surface of this dark mystery, the feeling grew upon him that the murder had been preconceived with the utmost cunning and caution, and that the facts so far brought to light, including his own discoveries, did not penetrate to the real design. The one conviction in his mind at the moment was that the man he and Merrington had interviewed on the previous afternoon had some connection with the mystery, and that an investigation of Nepcote's actions was the first step towards the solution of the murder. Colwyn based that belief on the apparently detached facts of the revolver, the patch of khaki he had found in the woods near the moat house, and the accident which had disclosed that Nepcote was carrying the address of a Hatton Garden jeweller in his pocket-book. These things, taken apart, had perhaps but slight significance, but considered as links in a chain of events which started in Philip Heredith's statement that he had first met his wife at a friend's house where Nepcote was also a guest, and finishing with the knowledge that Nepcote had not returned to France on the night of the murder, they assumed a significance which at least warranted the closest investigation. Colwyn was not affected by the fact that Superintendent Merrington looked at the case from an entirely different point of view. He did not want the help of Scotland Yard in solving the crime. He had too much contempt for the official mind in any capacity to think that assistance from such a source could be of value to him. He always preferred to work alone and unaided. It was the Anglo-Saxon instinct of fair play which had prompted him to tell Merrington about the missing necklace, so that there might be no unfair advantage between them. Merrington had received the information with the imperviable dogmatism of the official mind, strong in the belief of its own infallibility, resentful of advice or suggestion as an attempt to weaken its dignity. It seemed to Colwyn that not only had Merrington's ruffled dignity led his judgment astray in an attempt to fit the discovery of the missing necklace into his own theory of the case, but it had caused him to commit a grave mistake in putting Nepcote on his guard at a moment when the utmost circumspection of investigation was necessary. To Colwyn, at all events, the discovery of the missing necklace was of the utmost importance, because it substituted another motive for the murder, and a motive which carried with it the additional complication that the thief had some motive in trying to keep its disappearance secret as long as possible, by locking the jewel case after the jewels had been abstracted. If Hazel Rath had not stolen the necklace, the whole of the facts took on new values. It was quite true that the mystery of Hazel Rath's actions on the night of the murder, her subsequent silence after the recovery of the brooch and the handkerchief and the revolver in her mother's rooms, remained as suspicious as before, But the changed motive caused these points to assume a different complexion, even to the extent of suggesting that she might be a lesser participant in the crime, perhaps keeping silence in order to shield the greater criminal. Merrington, stiff-necked in his officialism, had been unable to see this changed aspect of the case, and, strong in his presumption of the girl's guilt, had acted with impulsive indiscretion in going to see Nepcote before attempting to trace the missing necklace. Colwyn's reflections were interrupted by the appearance of the porter from downstairs to announce a visitor. The visitor, partly obscured behind the burly frame of the porter in the doorway, was Detective Caldew of Scotland Yard. Colwyn had met him at various times and invited him to enter. As Colwyn had once said, his feelings towards all the members of the regular detective force were invariably friendly. It was not their fault, but the fault of human nature, that they were sometimes jealous of him. So he made Caldew welcome, and offered him a cigar. Caldew accepted the cigar and the proffered seat a little nervously. His was the type of temperament which is overawed in the presence of a more successful practitioner in the same line of business. He had long envied Colwyn his dazzling successes, but at the same time he had sufficient intelligence to understand that many of those successes stood in a class which he could never hope to attain. At the present moment, Caldew's feelings were divided between resentment at Colwyn's action in conveying information to Scotland Yard which had earned him a reprimand from Superintendent Merrington, and the anxious desire to ascertain what the famous private detective thought of the Heredith case. "Merrington has sent me round for the copy of the depositions he lent you yesterday." It was thus he announced the object of his visit. "Have you finished with it?" It was apparent from this statement that Superintendent Merrington's gratitude for information received might now be considered as past history. Colwyn, reflecting that it had lasted as long as that feeling usually does, congratulated himself on his forethought in having made a copy of the report. He handed the copy before him to his visitor. "I'm obliged for the loan of it," he said. "It makes interesting reading. Your own share in the original investigations has some excellent touches, if you'll permit me to say so. That trap for the owner of the brooch was a neat idea." Caldew's resentment waned under this compliment to his professional skill. "The trick would have worked, too, if I hadn't been called downstairs," he said. "The girl was quick enough to get into the room while I was out of it. Not that it mattered much, as things turned out, but it is a strange thing about this necklace, isn't it?" "Very. Has Merrington told you all about it?" "Yes, and he gave me a rare wigging for not discovering the loss. Between ourselves, I do not think that I was treated quite fairly about it. Miss Heredith never said a word to me about a jewel case being in the room. She took it downstairs before I arrived, and never mentioned it when I asked her if anything had been stolen. If she had told me, I should have had the case opened. But that didn't weigh with Merrington. He's beastly unfair, and never loses a chance to put the blame on to somebody else when anything goes wrong." "I am sorry if you got into trouble through my action in informing him," said Colwyn. "But of course you must realize that a discovery of such importance could not be kept secret." "That's quite true," replied Caldew in a softened voice. "Fortunately it does not affect the issue one way or the other. Mr. Heredith believes that Hazel Rath is innocent, and I suppose that is why he has called you into the case. But she is guilty, right enough. I tried to make that clear to Mr. Heredith, but he appears to be a man of fixed ideas. The question is, what has become of the necklace? My own impression is that she has hidden it somewhere. She had no opportunity to dispose of it before she was arrested." "That means you think she has stolen it?" "Why, of course." Caldew's confident tone died away at the expression of his companion's face. "Don't you?" "I do not." "Why not?" "For one thing, the jewel case was locked. How did the girl know where the key was kept?" "She might have got the knowledge from her mother. Mrs. Rath, as the housekeeper, would probably know all about the keys of the household." "Of the ordinary keys, yes. But that knowledge was hardly likely to extend to Mrs. Heredith's private keys, unless Miss Heredith told her. Even if Hazel Rath did know where the key was kept, it is difficult to believe that she searched for it after committing the murder, and then restored it to the drawer where it was kept. That argues too much cold-blooded deliberation even in a murderer, and more especially when the murderer is supposed to be a young girl. "I am not so sure of that," responded Caldew, with a shake of the head. "Murder is a cold-blooded crime. On the contrary, murders are almost invariably committed under the influence of the strongest excitement, even when the incentive is gain and the murder has been deeply premeditated. That is a remarkable truth in the psychology of murder. But the important fact about the theft of the necklace is that even if Hazel Rath knew where the key of the jewel case was kept, she had not time to obtain it from the drawer on the other side of the bed, steal the necklace, restore the key to its place, and escape from the room before the guests from downstairs entered the bedroom. If Hazel Rath was indeed the murderess, time was of paramount importance to her. She must have realized that the scream of her victim would alarm the household downstairs, and that some of the men must have started upstairs before the subsequent shot was fired." Caldew was silent for a space, cogitating over these points with a troubled look which contrasted with his previous confident expressions of opinion about the case. His inward perturbation was made manifest in the question, "Do you also share Mr. Heredith's view that Hazel Rath is innocent?" "I cannot say. The facts against her are very strong." "Of course they are strong," exclaimed Caldew eagerly, as though clutching this guarded expression of opinion as a boy for his own sinking conviction. "They are so strong that it is quite certain she committed the murder." Colwyn remained silent. A statement which was merely an expression of opinion did not call for words. Caldew, always impressionable, became uneasy under his companion's silence, and that uneasiness was tinctured in his mind with such a dread of the possibility of mistake that it flowed forth in impulsive words. "I wish you would tell me what you really think of the case, Mr. Colwyn. I have been waiting for years for the chance of handling a big murder like this, and now that it has come my way I should like to pull it off. It means a lot to me," he added simply. Colwyn reflected that he had already given away more information about the Heredith case than his judgment approved or his conscience dictated, but his kindly nature prompted him to help the anxious young man seated in front of him, who had so much more than he to gain by success. "I think there is more in this case than you and Merrington have yet brought to light," he said. "I suppose there is, if it is proved that Hazel Rath did not steal the necklace. But have you found out anything else besides the loss of the necklace?" Colwyn did not reply directly. He was glancing over the depositions again. "There are one or two curious points here," he remarked, as he turned over the leaves. "In the first place, the ammunition expert who was called at the inquest to give evidence about the bullet extracted from the body testified that in weight and in length it corresponded with the 7mm bullet made for a pinfire revolver. The bullet had undoubtedly been fired from the revolver which you found in Mrs. Rath's rooms. Bullets for English revolvers are not graded in millimetres, but there appears to be sufficient demand for this size to cause British firms to manufacture them. The nearest size to central fire cartridge to 7mm is called the 300, which is .3 of an inch. 7mm is .276 of an inch. The point to which I want to draw your attention is the extreme slightness and smallness of the revolver with which Mrs. Heredith was killed. As Captain Nepcote told Merrington yesterday, it is little more than a toy." "That struck me as soon as I saw it," said Caldew, "but I do not see what bearing the fact has on the case one way or another." "Nevertheless, it is a point not without importance when it is considered in conjunction with the other circumstances of the case. The evidence of the Government pathologist is also of interest. After stating the cause of death to be heart failure due to hemorrhage consequent upon the passage of the bullet through the lung, he mentions that there was a large scorched hole through the rest gown and undergarment which Mrs. Heredith was wearing at the time she was murdered. I noticed that when I was examining the body." "Was the dress stuff smouldering when you saw the body?" "No, but there was the smell of a burning fabric in the room." "The government pathologist says that the burnt hole was nearly 2 inches across, but he also states that the punctured wound made by the bullet was about the size of a threepenny piece. The disparity suggests two facts. In the first place, the shot must have been fired at very close range, very close indeed, considering the smallness of the revolver and the largeness of the burnt hole. In the next place, somebody must have extinguished the burning fabric before you arrived. Otherwise it would have smouldered in an ever-widening ring until the whole of the dead woman's garments were destroyed." "Mrs. Heredith may have extinguished it herself in her dying moments," said Caldew, who had been following his companion's deductions with the closest attention. "That is unlikely, in view of the nature of her injuries. The bullet, after traversing the left lung, lodged in the spinal column. After such a wound, Mrs. Heredith was not likely to be conscious of her actions." "It may have been extinguished by Musard, who tried to stop the flow of blood while Mrs. Heredith was dying." "He would have mentioned it to you. It is my intention to ask him, but my own opinion is that we are faced with a different explanation." "What is that?" "The presence of another person in the room." "Somebody who escaped through the window!" exclaimed Caldew, placing his own interpretation on the deduction. "Do you suspect anybody?" "Not exactly, but I intend to investigate Captain Nepcote's actions on the night of the murder." Caldew, who lacked some of the information possessed by his companion, found this jump too great for his mind to follow. "For what purpose?" he asked. "Nepcote returned to France before the murder was committed." "He did not. He stayed in London that night, and did not return to France until the following day. He explained that yesterday by stating that when he reached London after leaving the moat house he found another telegram from the War Office extending his leave for 24 hours. "Merrington said nothing of this to me. All he told me was that you and he had seen Nepcote, who identified the revolver as his property, and said that he had left it behind at the moat house by accident." "Merrington is a man of fixed ideas, to use your phrase. He insisted on trying to fit in the loss of the necklace with his own theory of Hazel Rath's guilt. It was his obstinacy which led him to commit the folly of going to see Captain Nepcote before endeavouring to trace the missing necklace. It is only fair to Nepcote to add that he volunteered the information that he did not return to France on the night of the murder." "That does not seem like the action of a man with anything to hide," commented Caldew thoughtfully. "Unless he was facing a dangerous situation. In that case frankness would be his best course to remove Merrington's suspicions. The fact that the murder was committed with his revolver is in itself a suspicious circumstance, in spite of the apparently plausible explanation. I have realized that all along. I had also previously acquainted Merrington with the fact that Nepcote did not return to France on the night of the murder, as was supposed. Merrington led up to that point skilfully enough, but it struck me that Nepcote saw the trap and took the boldest course. It gave him time, at all events." "Time for what?" "Time to profit by Merrington's folly in putting him on his guard. Time to permit him to make his escape, if he is actually implicated in the crime." "Surely you are reading too much into this," exclaimed Caldew in a protesting voice. "Nepcote's story seems to me quite consistent with what we know of his movements. Miss Heredith, when giving us the names of the guests who had been staying at the moat house, mentioned that Captain Nepcote had been recalled to France on the afternoon of the murder by a telegram from the War Office. Nepcote tells you that when he reached London he found another telegram awaiting him extending his leave. Surely that is consistent." "Is it consistent that the two telegrams were sent to different addresses? They would have been either both sent to the moat house or both sent to his London flat. That is, if they were sent by the War Office. Only a relative or a personal friend would take the trouble to send to different addresses. There lies the weak point of Nepcote's statement." "By Jove, there is a point in that," said Caldew in a startled tone. "But these are facts which can be ascertained," he added, as though seeking to reassure himself. "They can be ascertained too late. I have already set inquiries on foot, but it takes some time to gain any information about official telegrams. Nepcote has plenty of time to take advantage of Merrington's blunder if there is any occasion for him to do so. No matter what his explanation is, the fact remains that he was in England and not in France on the night the murder was committed, and I propose to find out how he spent the time. But it is of the first importance to find out what has become of the missing necklace, which is the really important clue. Is Scotland Yard making any investigations about it? Yes, Merrington has put me on to that because I let you score the point over him of discovering that it was missing. I am sure he hopes I will fall down over the job of tracing it. I shouldn't be surprised if I did, too. It's no easy thing to get on the track of missing jewellery, especially if it has been hidden. I have not even got a description of the necklace to help me. I can give you a description and perhaps help you in the work of tracing it. Can you? That's awfully good of you. Caldew's face showed that he meant his words. Have you any idea where it is? I have at least something to guide me in commencing the search, something which, curiously enough, I owe to Merrington's blunder in visiting Nepcote before he looked for the necklace. We will go across to Hatton Garden, and I will put my idea to the test. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of The Hand in the Dark. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Hand in the Dark by Arthur J. Rees. Chapter 21. On reaching the street, they crossed Ludgate Circus and directed their steps towards Hatton Garden by way of St. Bride's Street. A few minutes later, they emerged in that portion of Holborn which is graced by the mounted statue of a dead German prince acknowledging his lifelong obligations to British hospitality by raising his plumed hat to the London City and Midland Bank on the Viaduct corner. Hatton Garden, as every Londoner knows, begins on the other side of this improving spectacle, a short broad street which disdains to indicate by external opulence the wealth hidden within its walls, though to an eye practised in London ways there is a comforting suggestion of prosperity in its wide flagged pavements, comfortable brick buildings, and Jewish names which appear in gilt lettering on plate-glass windows. Colwyn walked quickly along, glancing at the displayed names. He had almost reached the Clerkenwell end of the garden when his eye was caught by the name of Austin Wendover, dealer in Oriental stones, gleaming in white letters on the blackboard indicator of a set of offices hived in a building on the corner of a side street. It was the name of the man he was searching for. He turned into the passage and mounted the stairs. Caldew followed him. On the landing of the first floor, another and smaller board gave the names of those tenants whose offices were at the back of the building. Mr. Wendover's was amongst them, and a pointing hand opposite it revealed that he conducted his business at the end of a long passage with a bend in the middle. When this passage was traversed, Mr. Wendover's name was once more seen, this time on a door, with a notice underneath inviting the visitor to enter without knocking. Within, a young Jew with a sensual face was busily writing at a desk in the corner, with his back to the door. He ceased and turned around at the sound of the opening door, and thrusting his fountain pen behind an ear already burdened with a cigarette, waited to be informed what the visitors wanted. "Is Mr. Wendover in?" Colwyn inquired. "Yes, he is. What name, please?" The young Jew scrambled down from his stool preparatory to carrying a message. In answer, Colwyn tendered Musard's card of introduction. The young Jew scanned it, shot an appraising glance at the two detectives, and vanished into an inner room. He reappeared swiftly in the doorway and beckoned them to enter. The inner room was furnished with leather chairs, a good carpet, and a large walnut table. Mining maps and framed photographs of famous diamonds hung on the walls, but there was nothing about the man seated at the table to suggest association with precious stones, except the gleam of his small grey eyes, which were as hard and glistening as the specimen gems in the showcase at his elbow. His face was long, thin, and yellow, of a bilious appearance. His gaunt frame was clothed in black, and his low white collar ended in front in 2 linen tags, fastened with a penny bone stud instead of the diamond which might have been expected. This device, besides dispensing with a necktie, revealed the base of a long, scraggy neck, with a tuft of grey hair pushing its way up from below and falling over the interstice of the collar, matching a similar tuft which dangled pendulously from the diamond merchant's nether lip. Altogether, as Mr. Austen Wendover sat at his table with his long yellow hands clasped in front of him, waiting for his visitors to announce their business, he looked not unlike a Methodist pastor about to say grace, or a Garden City apostle of culture for the masses, preparing to receive a vote of thanks for a lecture on English prose at a Workers' Mutual Improvement Society. Even his name suggested to the serious mind the compiler of an anthology of British war poets, or the writer of a book of nature studies, rather than the material wealth, female folly, late suppers, green rooms, frivolity and immorality brought before a vivid imagination by the mere mention of the word diamonds. "My name is Colwyn. My friend is Detective Caldew of Scotland Yard," said Colwyn, in response to Mr. Wendover's glance of interrogation. "We are in search of a little information, which we trust you will give us." "That depends upon what ye want to know." This reply, delivered in an abrupt and uncouth manner, suggested that the diamond merchant's disposition was anything but a cut and polished one. "Quite so. You have heard of the Heredith murder, I presume?" The diamond merchant nodded his head without speaking, and waited to hear more. "The Heredith necklace of pink pearls was stolen from Mrs. Heredith's room on the night that she was murdered, and we are endeavouring to trace it." "And what has that got to do with me?" "I have reason to think that the necklace may have been offered or sold in Hatton Garden. It may have been submitted to you." "What do ye mean by coming to me with such a question? What does Mr. Musard mean by sending ye here? Does he think I've turned receiver of stolen property at my time of life? I'm surprised at him." "My dear Mr. Wendover, Mr. Musard had no such thought in his mind. We simply came to you for information. Mr. Musard gave me your address as a reputable dealer of stones who would be likely to know if this necklace had been offered for sale in Hatton Garden." "Well, it has not been offered to me. I've handled no pearls for 12 months." "Would you know the Heredith necklace if it were offered to you?" "I would not, and I've already told ye it was not offered to me." Colwyn was nonplussed and disappointed, but the recollection of Nepcote's furtive glance and hasty concealment of the diamond merchant's card on the previous night prompted him to a further effort. "It is possible the necklace may have been broken up and the stones offered separately," he said. "The clasp contained a large and valuable blue diamond." "I tell ye I know nothing about it. I very rarely buy from private persons. It's not my way of doing business." "We have reason to suspect that the necklace was offered for sale by a young military officer, tall and good-looking, with blue eyes and brown hair slightly tinged with grey at the temples." "That description would apply to thousands of young officers. They're a harum-scarum lot, and dissipation soon turns a man's hair grey. I have had some of them here trying to sell family jewels for money to throw away on painted women. There was one who called some days ago in a half-intoxicated condition. He clapped me on the back as impudent as you please, and calling me a thing, a dear old thing, which is one of their slang phrases, asked me what he could screw out of me for a good diamond. I sent him and his diamond off with a flea in the ear." Mr. Wendover's gummy lips curved in a grim smile at the recollection. "Can you describe him more particularly?" asked Colwyn, with sudden interest. "I paid no particular attention to him, and I wouldn't know him again if he were to walk in the door. It was almost dark when he came, and my eyes are not young. But he was not the man ye're after. It was days before the murder." "Did he give you his name?" "He did not, and I wouldn't tell ye if he did. What's it to do with the object of your visit? You're a persistent sort of young fellow, but I'm not going to let ye hold a general fishing inquiry into my business. There are two kinds of foolish folk in this world. those who babble of their affairs to their womenfolk, and those who babble of them to strangers. I have no womenfolk, thank God, so I cannot talk to the futile creatures." "Then I shall not ask you to break the other half of your maxim on my account," said Colwyn, rising with a smile. "It would be no good if ye did," responded Mr. Wendover, with a reciprocatory grin which displayed 2 yellow fangs like the teeth of a walrus. "My business conscience is already pricking me for having said so much. He that holds his own counsel gives away nothing, except that he holds his counsel. Ye might do worse than lay that to your heart, Mr. Colwyn, in your walk through life. There's 50 years' experience behind it. Good-bye to ye, Mr. Colwyn, and ye, young man. I wish ye both luck in your search, but my advice is, try the pawn-shops." At the pressure of his thumb on the table, the young Jew appeared from the next room, as if summoned by a magic wand, to let the visitors out. "That's a queer old bird," said Caldew as they walked away. "Do you think he has told us the truth?" Colwyn did not reply. He was thinking rapidly, and wondering whether by any possibility he had made a mistake. But once more there flashed into his mind, like an image projected on a screen, the little scene which he alone had witnessed at the flat on the previous evening. The fluttering cards, the quick unconscious gesture of concealment, and the startled glance which so plainly reflected the dread of discovery. No, there was no mistake there, but the explanation lay deeper. They had reached the angle of the narrow passage which led to the front outlet of the offices. A small window was fixed at the dark turn of the long corridor to admit light. Colwyn chanced to glance through this window as he reached it, and his quick eye took in the figure of a man standing motionless in a narrow alley of the side street below. He was almost concealed behind an archway, but it was apparent to the detective that he was watching the corner building. As Colwyn looked at him, he slightly changed his position, and his face came into view. With a quick imperative gesture to his companion, Colwyn ran swiftly along the remainder of the corridor and down the flight of stairs into Hatton Garden. Caldew followed more slowly, puzzled by the other's strange action. When he reached the doorway, Colwyn was nowhere to be seen, so he waited in the entrance. After the lapse of a few minutes, he saw Colwyn returning from the direction of Clerkenwell. "He has got away," he said as he reached Caldew. His voice was a little breathless, as though with running. "He? Who?" Colwyn drew him into the empty entrance hall before he answered. "Nepcote. He was waiting outside. I saw him through the upstairs window. He either followed us here or has been waiting to see if we came. I should have foreseen this." A flicker of unusual agitation on Colwyn's calm face increased Caldew's mental confusion. "I don't understand," he stammered. Nepcote, why should he be watching us?" "Because he penetrated the truth last night. He knew he was in danger." "But why should he follow us here?" "He accidentally dropped some cards from his pocket-book when giving Merrington an address at his flat last night, and one of them was Wendover's business card. Merrington did not see it. It would have conveyed nothing to him if he had. But I did. Nepcote knew that I saw it, and must have realized that I suspected him. He has been watching my rooms and followed us here, or he has been hanging around this place to see if I called on Wendover." "Even now I do not see the connection. If Wendover told us the truth, Nepcote has not been to him with a necklace. Then what did it matter to Nepcote whether you came here or not?" "Nepcote may have been the man who offered the diamond to Wendover." "That is impossible. Wendover says that man called some days before the murder." "Still, it may have been Nepcote." "That goes beyond me," said Caldew, with a puzzled look. "What are you implying?" "Nothing at present. Every step in this case convinces me that we are faced with a very deep mystery. It isn't worth while to hazard a guess, because guessing is always unsatisfactory." "Perhaps we had better try and get a little more out of Wendover," said Caldew. "That would be merely waste of time. He has not got the necklace, and he is unable to describe the man who offered him the diamond. I believe now that it was Nepcote, but that doesn't matter one way or another. It is far more important to know that he came here today to watch for us. That implies that he has reason to fear investigations about the necklace. The inference to be drawn is that Nepcote is responsible for the disappearance of the necklace, and is therefore deeply implicated in the murder." "Perhaps it was not Nepcote that you saw," suggested Caldew. He felt that the remark was a feeble one, but he was bewildered by the sudden turn of events, and in a frame of mind which clutches at straws. "Put that doubt out of your mind," said Colwyn. "I saw his face distinctly. He had disappeared by the time I got down. The alley where he was standing commanded a view of the entrance of this building. I ascertained that by standing in the same spot. His flight is another proof, though that was not needed, of his guilty knowledge and complicity in this murder. Why should he run away? According to his own story last night, he had nothing to fear. But now, by his own actions, he has brought the utmost suspicion on himself." "I suppose it is no use searching about here for him," remarked Caldew, glancing gloomily out of the doorway. "Not in the least. The neighbourhood is a warren of alleys and side streets from here to Gray's Inn Road." "Then I shall go up to his flat at once," said Caldew. "He has not had time to go back." "He will not return to his flat. We have seen the last of him until we catch him. He has had 2 warnings, and he is not likely to be guilty of the folly of waiting to see whether lightning strikes thrice in the same spot. He will get away for good this time if he can. Nevertheless, it is worth while going to the flat. We may pick up some points there." Colwyn uttered these last words in a lower tone at the sight of 2 office girls descending the staircase with much chatter and laughter. "Let us go, then." They travelled by bus from Gray's Inn Road as far as Oxford Circus, and walked along a number of quiet, secluded streets, the backwaters of the West End, in order to reach Sherryman Street from the lower end, which, with a true sense of the fitness of things, was called Sherryman Street Approach. If the approach had not been within a stone's throw of Sherryman Square, it might have been called a slum. It had tenement houses with swarms of squalid children playing in the open doorways. Its shops offered East End food, mussels and whelks, 2-eyed steaks, reeking fish and chips, and horsemeat for the cheap foreign element. There were several public houses with groups of women outside drinking and gossiping, all wearing the black shawls which are as emblematic of the lower-class London woman as a chasuble to a priest, or a blue-tattooed upper lip to a high-caste Maori beauty. A costermonger hawked frozen rabbits from a donkey-cart, with a pallid woman following behind to drive away the mangy cats which quarrelled in the road for the oozing blood which dripped from the cart's tail. An Italian woman, swarthy, squat, and intolerably dirty, ground out the Marseillaise from a barrel organ with a shivering monkey capering atop, waving a small Union Jack, and impatiently rattling a tin can for coppers. To turn from this squalid quarter into Sherryman Street was to pass from the east to the west end of London at a step. It was as though an invisible line of demarcation had been drawn between the lower and upper portion of the street, and held inviolate by the residents of each portion. There were no public houses or fish shops in Sherryman Street, no organ grinders, costermongers, unclean children, or women in black shawls. It had quiet, seclusion, clean pavements, polished door-knockers, and white curtains at the windows of its well-kept houses, which grew in dignity to the semblance of town mansions at the square end. Number 10 showed a blank, closed, stone exterior to the passer-by, like an old grey, secretive face. As they approached it, Colwyn, with a slight movement of his head, drew his companion's attention to the upper windows which belonged to Nepcote's flat. The blinds were down. "It looks as if Nepcote left last night," he said. The sight of the drawn blinds, like yellow eyelids in the grey face, awakened some secret irritation in Caldew's breast, and with it the realization of his powers as an officer of Scotland Yard. "I shall force a way in and see," he angrily declared. "Better get a key from the housekeeper," suggested Colwyn. "The women who look after these bachelor flats always have duplicate keys. But the front door is ajar. Let us go upstairs first." They ascended the stairs to the flat, and the first thing they noticed was a Yale key in the keyhole of the door. "A sign of mental upset," commented Colwyn. "At such moments people forget the little things." They opened the door and entered. The front room was much as Colwyn had seen it the previous night. The flowers drooped in their bowl, the chorus girls smirked in their silver settings, the framed racehorses and their stolid trainers looked woodenly down from the pink walls. "Nepcote does not seem to have taken anything away with him," remarked Caldew, looking into the bedroom. "The wardrobe is full of his uniforms, but the bed has not been occupied." "Here is proof that he has fled," said Colwyn, flinging back the lid of the desk which stood in the sitting-room. It was filled to the brim with a mass of torn papers. "Anything compromising?" asked Caldew, eagerly approaching to look at the litter. "No, only bills and invitations. Any dangerous letters have been burnt there." He pointed to the grate, which was heaped with blackened fragments. "He's made a good job of it, too," he added, as he went to the fireplace and bent over. "There's not the slightest chance of deciphering a line. But it would be as well to search his clothes. He may have forgotten some letters in the pockets." Caldew took the hint and disappeared into the inner room, leaving Colwyn examining the contents of the grate. He returned in a few minutes to say that he had found nothing in the clothes except a few Treasury notes and some loose silver in a trousers pocket. "That looks as if he had bolted in such a hurry that he forgot to take his change with him," said Colwyn. "It is another interesting revelation of his state of mind, because there is very little doubt that he returned to the flat this morning after leaving it last night." "How do you arrive at that conclusion?" "By the burnt letters in the grate. They are still warm. He was in such a state of fear that he dared not sleep in the flat last night, but he returned this morning to burn his letters and change into civilian clothes. Then he rushed away again in such a hurry that he forgot his money. There is nothing more to be seen here. We had better make a few inquiries of the housekeeper as we go downstairs." They walked out, and Caldew locked the door behind him and placed the key in his pocket. When they reached the entrance hall, Colwyn paused outside the door of the recess where the housekeeper lurked, like an octopus in a pool. At Colwyn's knock, a white face, topped by a white cap, came into view through the narrow slit in the curtained glass half of the door, and swam towards them in the interior gloom, after the manner of the head of a materialized ghost in a spirit medium's parlour. The door opened, and the apparition appeared in the flesh, looking at them with stony eyes. Caldew undertook the conversation. "Did Captain Nepcote sleep here last night?" he curtly asked. "I don't know." "Well, has he been here this morning?" "I don't know." The tone of the second reply was even more expressionless than the first, if that were possible. "It's your business to know," said Caldew angrily. "It's not my business to discuss Captain Nepcote's private affairs with strangers." The woman turned back into her room without another word, closing the door behind her. "Damn her!" muttered Caldew in intense exasperation. These ancient females learned the wisdom of controlling their natural garrulity when placed in charge of bachelors' flats, said Colwyn with a laugh. "We will get nothing out of her if we stay here all day, so we had better go." "I am going straight back to Scotland Yard," Caldew announced with sudden decision when they reached the pavement. "I must tell Merrington all about this morning's work, and the sooner the better. We must have the flat watched. Perhaps Nepcote may return." "He will not return," said Colwyn. "He knows that we are after him, and that the flat will be watched. But it is a good idea not to let him have too long a start. Come, let us see if we can find a taxi, and I will drop you at Scotland Yard." They walked along to Sherryman Square, and esteemed themselves fortunate in picking up a cruising taxicab, with a driver sufficiently complacent to drive them in the direction they wished to go. End of Chapter 21. Chapter 22 of The Hand in the Dark. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Hand in the Dark by Arthur J. REES. Chapter 22. It was to Merrington's credit as an official that he suppressed his feelings as a man on hearing Caldew's story, and did everything possible to retrieve the situation once he was convinced that Nepcote had fled. Any lingering doubts he may have had were scattered on learning, after confidential inquiry at Whitehall, that Captain Nepcote had not put in an appearance at the War Office that day, and had neither requested nor been granted leave of absence from his duties. On receipt of this information, Merrington turned to his office telephone, and, receiver in hand, bellowed forth peremptory instructions, which set in motion the far-reaching organization of Scotland Yard for the capture of a fugitive from justice. Nepcote's description was circulated to police stations. Detectives were told off to keep an eye on outgoing trains and the docks, and the entrances to the tubes and underground railways were watched. After enclosing London, Merrington made a wider cast, and long before nightfall he had flung around England a net of fine meshes through which no man could wriggle. But it is difficult even for Scotland Yard to lay quick hands on a fugitive in the vast city of London, as Merrington well knew. While waiting for the net to close over his destined captive, he decided, in the new strange turn of the case, to investigate the whole of the circumstances afresh. Inquiries set afoot in London with the object of discovering all that could be learnt of Nepcote's career and Violet Heredith's single life occupied an important share in Scotland Yard's renewed investigations into the Heredith murder. Caldew was sent to Heredith to look for new facts. He returned after a day's absence with information which might have been obtained before if chance had not directed suspicion to Hazel Rath, with a story of an unknown young man who had left the London train to Heredith at Weydene Junction on the night of the murder. The story, as extracted from an unintelligent ticket collector, threw no light on the identity of the stranger, beyond a statement that he had worn a long, light trench coat, beneath which the collector had caught a glimpse of khaki uniform as the gentleman felt for his ticket at the barrier. On that slight information, Caldew had pursued inquiries across a long 2 miles of country between Weydene and the Moat House, and had deemed himself fortunate in finding a farm labourer who, on his homeward walk that night, had been passed by a young man in a long coat making rapidly across the fields in the direction of Heredith. The labourer had stared after the retreating figure until it disappeared in the darkness, and had then gone home without thinking any more of the incident. Caldew was so impressed by the significance of the second appearance of the man in the trench coat that he had timed himself in a fast walk over the same ground from Weydene to the Moat House, and was able to cover the distance in half an hour. On the basis of these facts, he pointed out to Merrington that if Nepcote was the man who left the train at Weydene at 7 o'clock, he had time to walk across the fields and reach the Moat House by 7:30, which was 10 minutes before the murder was committed. Merrington admitted the possibility, but refused to accept the inference. He was forced by recent events to accept the theory of Nepcote's implication in the mystery, but he was not prepared to believe without much more definite proof that he was the murderer. He was still strong in his belief that Hazel Rath was the person who had killed Mrs. Heredith, whatever the young man's share in the crime might be. The discovery about the man in the trench coat was all very well as far as it went, and perhaps formed another clue in the puzzling set of circumstances of the case, but it did not carry them very far, and certainly did nothing to lessen the weight of evidence against the girl who was charged with the murder. Merrington was forced back on the conclusion that the most important step towards the solution of the mystery was to lay hold of Nepcote, and to that end he directed his own efforts and that of the service of the great organization at his command. As the days went on, he supplemented his original arrangements for Nepcote's arrest with guileful traps. The female dragon who guarded masculine reputations at 10 Sherryman Street was badgered into cold anger by pretty girls who sought with tips and blandishments to glean scraps of information about the missing tenant. Scented letters in female handwriting marked "Important" appeared in the letter racks of Nepcote's West End clubs. Merrington even inserted an advertisement in the personal column of the Times, setting forth a touching female appeal to Nepcote for a meeting in a sequestered spot. At the end of 3 days, with no sign of Nepcote in that period, Merrington was compelled to make application to the Sussex magistrates for another adjournment of the police court proceedings, on the ground that fresh information needed investigation before Scotland Yard could proceed with the charge against Hazel Rath. An additional week was granted with reluctance by the chairman of the bench, a nonconformist draper with political ambitions, who seized the opportunity to impress the electors of a constituency he was nursing for the next general election by making some spirited remarks on the sanctity of British liberty, which he coupled with a scathing reference to the dilatory methods of Scotland Yard. He let it be understood that the police must be prepared at the next hearing to go on with the charge against the prisoner, or withdraw it altogether. In the face of these awkward alternatives, Merrington pursued the quest for Nepcote with vigour. The men working immediately under his instructions were spurred into an excess of energy which brought about the detention of several young men who could not adequately explain themselves or their right to liberty in the great city of London. But none of these captures turned out to be Nepcote. Merrington believed he was hiding in London, but at the end of 5 days he still remained mysteriously at liberty in spite of the constant search for him. He seemed to have disappeared as completely as though he had passed out of the world, and merged his identity into a chiselled name and a banal aspiration on a tombstone. In the angry consciousness of failure, Merrington was not blind to the fact that he had only his own impetuosity to blame for allowing Nepcote to slip through his fingers. His mistake was due to his dislike of private detectives, and his unbelief in modern deductive methods of crime solution. His own system, which is the system of Scotland Yard, was based on motive and knowledge. If he found a strong motive for a crime, he searched for the person to whom it pointed. If there was no apparent motive, he fell back on his great knowledge of the underworld and its denizens to fit a criminal to the crime. The system has its measure of success, as the records of Scotland Yard attest. Merrington had brought both methods to bear in his handling of the Heredith case. When his original investigations failed to reveal a motive for the murder, he determined to return to London to ascertain what dangerous criminals were at liberty who might have committed the murder. His own view then was that the murder was the work of an old hand who had entered the moat house to commit burglary, and had murdered Mrs. Heredith to escape identification. The isolation of the moat house, the presence of guests with valuable jewels, the time chosen for the crime, and the scream of the victim, tended to confirm him in this belief. Caldew's chance discovery about Hazel Rath, and the subsequent events which arrayed such strong circumstantial evidence against her, brought the other side of the system uppermost, and set Merrington seeking for a motive which would accord with the presumption of the girl's guilt. Having found that motive, he was satisfied that he had done his duty, and he thought very little more about the case. It was his tenacious adhesion to conservative methods which caused him to blunder in his treatment of Colwyn's information about the missing necklace. He rarely acted on impulse. His habitual distrust of humanity was deep, and to it was wedded a wariness which was the heritage of long experience. But his obstinate conviction of Hazel Rath's guilt led him to make a false move in his effort to square the loss of the necklace with the evidence against the girl. His own poor opinion of human nature hindered him from seeing, as Colwyn had seen, any inconsequence between such widely different motives as maddened love and theft. That was one of those subtle differentiations of human psychology in which his coarse-grained temperament was at fault. It is probable that Merrington's dislike of private detectives contributed to obscure his judgment at a critical moment. He was unable to see that Colwyn, by reason of his intellect and practical capacity, stood in a class apart and alone. In his contemplation of the case, Merrington's thoughts turned to Colwyn, and he wondered in what direction the private detective's investigations into the case had progressed, if they had progressed at all, since he had seen him last. In a chastened mood, he reflected that Colwyn had not only given him a warning which was annoyingly different from other advice in being well worth following, but had acted generously in informing him of the missing necklace when he might have kept the discovery to himself in order to score a point over Scotland Yard and place one of the Yard's most distinguished officials in an awkward position. With a belated but unconscious recognition of the intelligence which far surpassed his own, Merrington felt that it would be worth while to have another talk with Colwyn in the hope of finding some way out of the perplexities in which he had plunged himself by permitting Nepcote to escape. The next interview, which was of his seeking, took place at Colwyn's rooms in the evening, after Merrington had previously arranged for it by telephone. The face of the private detective revealed neither surprise nor resentment at the sight of Merrington. He invited his guest to sit down, and then seated himself a little distance from the table on which whisky and cigars were set out. "Well, Mr. Colwyn, you were right, and I was wrong about that fellow Nepcote," Merrington commenced, realizing that it was best to come to the point at once. "I wish now that I had followed your advice." "If you hadn't gone to see him, perhaps you wouldn't know as much as you know now," said Colwyn dryly. "That's one way of looking at it," responded Merrington with his great laugh. "Unfortunately, that interview caused Nepcote to bolt, and so far he has shown us a clean pair of heels." "You've had no news of him?" "Only a lot of false reports. I am convinced that he is still hiding in London, but the trouble is to get hold of him. These infernal darkened streets make it more difficult. A wanted man can walk along them at night right under the nose of the police without fear of being seen." "Have you made any fresh discoveries about the case?" "We have ascertained that a man who may have been Nepcote was seen near the moat house on the night of the murder." Colwyn nodded indifferently. The tracing of Nepcote's movements on the night of the murder was to him one of the minor points of the problem, like the first pawn move in chess, essential but without real significance in view of the inevitable inference of the flight. "I have been working on the case from this end," he said. "In what direction?" "Trying to arrive at the beginning of the mystery. I have been endeavouring to find out something about Mrs. Heredith's earlier life. It struck me that it might throw some light on the subsequent events." "I have been investigating along similar lines. Shall we compare notes?" "With pleasure, but I should think that you have been able to find out more than I have been able to discover single-handed. For one thing, I have seen Lady Vaughan, the wife of Sir William Vaughan, of the War Office. She is a kind and gracious woman, taking a great interest in the hundreds of girl clerks employed at her husband's department in Whitehall. Last winter she gave a series of dances at her house in Knightsbridge, and the girls were invited in turns. Mr. Heredith was present at one of these functions." "So much I know," said Merrington. "Then you are probably aware that Captain Nepcote was also present that evening, and brought several other young officers with him. It was he who introduced Philip Heredith to the girl whom he afterwards married." "I knew Nepcote was a guest at one of the dances, but it is news to me that he introduced the girl to young Heredith. Lady Vaughan did not tell us this." "Lady Vaughan did not know. I ascertained the fact later from one of the guests who witnessed the introduction. I attach some importance to the point. Last winter Philip Heredith and Nepcote were on fairly intimate terms, working together in the same room at the War Office, and sometimes going together to the houses of mutual friends. It was evidently a case of the attraction of opposites." "It must have been," replied Merrington emphatically. "I have had inquiries made about Nepcote, and I should not have thought that he would have appealed to Mr. Heredith. There is nothing actually wrong, so far as we can learn, but he had the reputation before the war of a fast and idle young man about town, with a weakness for women and gambling. He came into a few thousands some years ago, but soon spent it. I imagine that he has subsisted principally on credit and gambling since he squandered his money, for he is certainly not the type of man to live on his pay as an officer. As a matter of fact, he was in serious trouble with the army authorities recently for not paying his mess bills in France. He was not brought up to the army, and he has seen very little active service. He got his captain's commission about 12 months after the war commenced, when the War Office was handing out commissions like boxes of matches. But he managed to keep under the Whitehall umbrella until quite recently. He seems to have a bit of a pull somewhere, though I cannot find out where. Perhaps it is his charm of manner. Everybody who knows him says he has a charming manner, though it wasn't apparent to me that night I interviewed him at his flat." "Perhaps he was too afraid to exercise it on that occasion," suggested Colwyn with a smile. "He must have thought that it was all up with him." "Have you discovered anything about Mrs. Heredith's antecedents?" asked Merrington, with an abruptness which suggested that he had little relish for the last remark. "Very little, apart from the fact that she lived in rooms, and had no real girl friends, so far as I can ascertain. Apparently she was a girl who played a lone hand, as they say in America. The type is not uncommon in large cities. My information, such as it is not of the least importance one way or the other." "I have learnt very little more than you, except that she changed her rooms pretty frequently, but always kept within an easy radius of the West End, living in dull but respectable neighbourhoods like Russell Square and Woburn Place. It was precious little time she spent there, though. The people of these places know nothing about her except that she used to go out in the morning and did not return till late at night, generally in a taxi and alone, so far as is known. She was apparently one of those bachelor girls who have sprung into existence in thousands during the war, one of that distinct species who trade on their good looks and are out for a good time, but keep sufficiently on the safe side of the fence to be careful of their reputations. It's part of their stock in trade. Such girls contrive to go everywhere and see everything, at the expense of young men with more money than brains who have been caught by their looks. It's the Savoy for lunch, a West End restaurant for dinner, review, late supper, and home in a taxi, with perhaps a kiss for the lot by way of payment. The War Office was a godsend to this type of girl. It gives them jobs with nothing to do, with a kind of official standing thrown in, and the chance of meeting plenty of young officers over on leave from the front, with money to burn and hungry for pretty English faces. It is difficult to find out anything about these bachelor girls. They have no homes, only a place to sleep in. They confide in nobody, and their men friends will never give them away. Almost any woman will give away a man, but I have never yet known a man to give away a woman." "If Mrs. Heredith was that type of girl, it is possible that some early episode or forgotten flirtation in her past life is mixed up with the mystery of her death." "You think that, do you?" asked Merrington, regarding his companion attentively. "How else can we explain Nepcote's appearance in the mystery, except on the ground that he may have murdered her for the necklace? It is important to bear in mind that Nepcote knew her in her single days. If she had a secret, she has taken it to the grave with her. There remains Nepcote, who is deeply implicated in the case in some way. You may learn something from him if you can catch him and induce him to speak, though I must confess I find it difficult to reconcile the supposition that he committed the murder with the known circumstances of the case." "There I agree with you," exclaimed Merrington. "What is Hazel Rath's position if we admit any such supposition? Nothing yet has come to light to shake the evidence which points to her as the person who murdered Mrs. Heredith." "Does she still refuse to speak?" "Yes, she is as obstinate as a mule and as mute as a fish. I sent a very clever woman detective down to the jail at Lewes to try and coax her to say something, but she could get nothing out of her. She said she had no statement to make and nothing whatever to say. She refused to go beyond that." "She may have some strong reason for keeping silence," remarked Colwyn thoughtfully. "Arrested persons sometimes remain silent under a grave charge because they are anxious to keep certain knowledge in their possession from the police. Nepcote's implication in the case lends colour to the theory that Hazel Rath may be keeping silent for some such purpose." "In order to shield Nepcote?" "It is possible, though I do not think we are in a position to infer that much without further knowledge. But now that we know that Nepcote is connected with the case, I certainly think that a strong effort should be made to induce Hazel Rath to speak." "It is not to be done," replied Merrington, with an emphatic shake of the head. "The girl is not to be drawn." "Have you told her about the recent developments of the case?" "About Nepcote, do you mean?" "Yes." "Certainly not," replied Merrington in a tone of outraged officialism. To give the girl that piece of information before I know what it means would place such a powerful weapon in the hands of the lawyer for the defense that I should have to withdraw the charge against Hazel Rath at the next police court proceedings if I did not arrest Nepcote in the meantime. I do not want any dramatic development, as the idiotic newspapers call it, in my cases. There is a certain amount of public sympathy with this girl already. I think you stand to gain more than you lose by telling her that Nepcote is suspected. I prefer to arrest Nepcote first. We may get him at any moment, and then I hope we shall find out where we stand in this case. But what do you mean by saying that I have more to gain than lose by telling the girl about him? If she is keeping silent to shield Nepcote, she is likely to reveal the truth when she knows that there is nothing more to be gained by silence. She will then begin to think of herself. In my opinion, you have now an excellent weapon in your hand to force her to speak. Can we go so far as to assume that she is keeping silence to shield him? Let us assume that they went to Mrs. Heredith's room together for the purpose of murder and robbery. The girl, we will suppose, fired the shot, and Nepcote escaped from the window with the necklace. Is Hazel Rath likely to reveal such a story when she knows it will not save herself? Your assumptions carry you too far, returned Colwyn. Our presumptive knowledge does not take us that distance. Till Nepcote's share in the case is explained, it is useless indulging in speculations outside our premises. Let us defer inferences until we have marshalled more facts. We do not know whether more than one pair of eyes witnessed the murder of Mrs. Heredith. The theory that Hazel Rath fired the shot is merely a presumption of fact, and not an actual certainty. Much is still hidden in this case, and the question is, can Hazel Rath enlighten us? As she and Nepcote are now both implicated, it seems to me that the best inducement to get her to speak is by letting her know that you have arrested Nepcote. In my opinion, the experiment is well worth trying. Merrington rose to his feet and paced across the room, pondering over the proposal. "I am inclined to believe you are right," he said. "At any rate, I shall go down to Lewes to-morrow and put it to the test. I would ask you to accompany me, but it would be a little irregular." "I shall be content to learn the result," Colwyn answered. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of The Hand in the Dark. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Hand in the Dark by Arthur J. Rees. Chapter 23. There are moments when the human brain refuses to receive communication from its peripheries, and the rapidity of thought becomes so slow that it can be measured by minutes. The stage of consciousness on which life's drama is solitarily played for every human being is too circumscribed to expand all at once for the reception of a strange and unexpected image. Such moments follow in the wake of a great shock, like a black curtain descending on a lighted scene. When the curtain begins to rise again, it is on a darkened stage, on which the objects are seen dimly at first, then clearer as returning intelligence, working slowly for the accommodation of the new setting, places the fresh impression in order with the throng of previously existing ideas. Such a moment seemed to have come to Hazel Rath as she stood looking at Merrington, who sat in an easy-chair on the other side of the table, confronting her with the tangible perception of his massive presence, reinforced by the weight of an authority which, if not so perceptible, was sufficiently apparent in the stolid blue back of a policeman on duty outside the glass door, and in the barred windows of the little room to which she had been brought to receive the news which had just been conveyed to her. But she gave no sign of having heard, or at least understood, the import of Merrington's relation. Her dark eyes wandered around the little office and slowly returned to the face of the big man who was watching her so closely. Her look, which had at first been one of utter bewilderment, now revealed a trace of incredulity which suggested a returning power for the assimilation of ideas. But she did not speak. "Have you nothing to say?" Merrington demanded. He had been a silent listener to many criminal confessions in his time, but in the unusual reversion of roles he was becoming unreasonably angry with the girl for not repaying his confidence with her own story. His loud hectoring voice startled her, and seemed to accelerate the mechanism of her mind into the association of her surroundings with her position. "Why did you bring me here to torture me?" she cried, with a sudden rush of shrill utterance which was, in its way, almost as pitiful and surprising as her previous silence. "Oh, why cannot you leave me alone?" She threw out her arms wildly, then, as if realizing the futility of gesture, dropped them helplessly to her side. There was something in the action which suggested a bird trying to stretch its wings in a cramped cage. Her quivering lips, tense facial muscles, and strained yet restless bearing plainly revealed an unbalanced temperament, bending beneath the weight of a burden too heavy and sustained. As an experienced police official, Merrington was well versed in the little signs which indicate the breaking point of imprisonment in those unused to it. He saw that Hazel Rath had reached a state in which kindness and consideration, but no other means, might induce her to tell all she knew. "Come now, my good girl," he said in a gentle, pleasant voice which would have astonished Caldew beyond measure if he had heard it. "Nobody wants to torture you. On the contrary, I have come down from London purposely to help you." He paused for a moment in order to allow this remark to sink into her mind, and then went on. "I do not think that you quite understood what I have been trying to tell you. I will tell you again, and I wish you to listen to me for your own sake." He glanced at her again, and, satisfied that he had now gained her attention, repeated the news he had endeavoured to tell her previously. The story, which he embellished with additional details as he went on, was a practical demonstration of the trick of conveying a false impression without telling an actual untruth. Merrington's sole aim was to convince Hazel that further silence on her part was useless, so, to that end, he used the incident of his visit to Nepcote's flat in a way to suggest that Nepcote's admission of the ownership of the revolver amounted to an admission of his own complicity in the murder. It was an adroit narration. Merrington conceded that much to himself, not without some pride in his own creation, but he was not prepared for its immediate and overmastering effect on the girl. She listened to him with an intensity of interest which was in the strangest contrast with her former inattention and indifference. When Merrington reached the point of his revelations by telling her about the missing necklace, in order to assure her that the police were aware that Nepcote had gained more from the commission of the crime than she had, she surprised him by springing to her feet, her eyes blazing with excitement. "I knew it would be proved that I am innocent," she exclaimed. "Now I can tell you all I know." "It is the very best course you can pursue," responded Merrington with emphasis. "I know it. I see it now. Oh, I have been very foolish. But A burst of hysterical tears choked further utterance. Merrington waited patiently until she recovered herself. He was troubled by no qualms of gentlemanly etiquette at watching the distress of the distraught girl sobbing wildly at the little table between them. There is a wide difference between pampered beauty in distress and a female prisoner in self-abasement. So he waited composedly enough until she lifted her head and regarded him with dark, wistful eyes through a glitter of tears. "You had better tell me all," he said. "Yes, I will tell you everything now," she quickly replied. "Before you do so, it is my duty to warn you that any statement you make may be used in evidence against you at your trial," Merrington said, with a swift resumption of his official manner. "At the same time, I think you will be acting in your own interest by keeping nothing back." "I quite understand, but it is such a strange story that I hardly know how to begin." "Tell me everything from the first. That will be the best way." "That night I went up to Mrs. Heredith's room just to see her," she commenced, almost in a whisper. "My mother had told me earlier in the evening that she was alone in her room suffering from a headache. I thought I would take the opportunity while the others were at dinner to go up to her room and ask if she wanted anything. So I left my mother's room and walked quietly down the hall to the left wing. There was nobody about. All the guests were at dinner, and the servants were busy in the kitchen and the dining room. When I got upstairs, I noticed that Mrs. Heredith's door was open a little, and I saw that there was no light in the room. I thought that strange until I remembered she had been suffering from a bad headache, and probably had turned off the light to rest her head. I did not knock because I thought she might be asleep. I was just going to turn away when I heard a sound like a sob within the room. I listened and heard it again. I hardly knew what to do at first, but the thought came to me that perhaps Mrs. Heredith was worse and needed someone. So I pushed open the door and went in. I know the moat house well, so I was aware that the switch of the electric light was by the side of the fireplace, near the head of the bed, and not close to the door as in the other rooms. To turn on the light, I had to walk across the room. It was very dark, and I walked cautiously for fear of stumbling and alarming Mrs. Heredith. Twice I stopped to listen, and once I heard a sound like somebody whispering. I was dreadfully nervous because I didn't know whether I was doing right or wrong by going into Mrs. Heredith's room like that, but something seemed to urge me on. I must have mistaken my direction in the dark, for I couldn't find the electric switch. I kept running my hand along the wall in search of it, and while I was doing this, somebody caught me suddenly by the throat. All the blood in my veins seemed to turn to ice, and I screamed loudly. Immediately I screamed, the hand let go, but I was too frightened to move. It was so silent in the room then that I could hear my own heart beating, but as I stood there by the wall, not daring to move, I thought I heard a rustling sound by the window. My hands kept wandering over the wall behind me, trying to find the switch of the light. Then suddenly there was a dreadful sound, the report of a gun. It seemed to fill the room with echoes which rolled to the window and back again. As the sound of the report died away, my fingers touched the switch, and I turned on the light. I was standing close to the head of the bed, and the first thing I noticed was something glittering on the carpet at my feet. I stooped and picked it up. It was a revolver. Then my eyes turned to the bed, and I saw poor Mrs. Heredith. She was lying quite still with blood on her mouth. I could see that she was still alive, because her eyes looked at me. At that terrible sight I forgot everything except that she was in agony. I was bending over her, wiping her mouth, when I caught the sound of footsteps running to the stairs. It flashed across my mind that I must not be found there, in a room where I had no right to be, holding in my hand a revolver which had just been discharged. I switched off the light and ran out of the room. The light from the landing outside guided me to the door. I had just time to get outside and slip behind the velvet curtains when some of the gentlemen appeared on the landing. I stayed there hidden for some time, too frightened to move, and expecting every moment to be discovered. I could hear them moving about searching, and I thought that somebody would draw aside the curtains and see me hiding underneath. But nobody came near me. I heard them go into Mrs. Heredith's room, and Mr. Musard started talking. The corridor was silent, and it seemed to me that I had a chance of escaping downstairs if the staircase was clear. I crept across to the balusters, still keeping under the cover of the curtains, and looked over. I could see nobody in the hall downstairs. I slipped the revolver into my dress and ran downstairs as quickly as I could. I got to the hall without meeting anyone, and then I knew that I was safe. But just as I turned into the passage leading to my mother's rooms, I heard the dining-room door open. I looked back and saw Tufnell come out and go upstairs, but he did not see me. Then I reached my mother's rooms. She was silent so long that Merrington thought she had finished her story. "And what about your brooch, the brooch which you dropped in the room? When did you get that again?" "I did not miss it until some time after I had returned downstairs. I wondered at first where I had dropped it. I then remembered the hand on my throat which must have unloosened the brooch and caused it to fall. I knew it was necessary for me to recover it, so it would not be known that I had been in the room. The house was very quiet then, and the hall was empty, though I could hear the murmur of voices in the library. So I walked along the hall and ran upstairs. The door of the bedroom was partly open, and by the light within I could see that the room was empty, except for her. I went into the room. The first thing I saw was my little brooch shining on the carpet close by the bedside, near where I had been standing when the hand clutched at my throat. I picked it up and ran downstairs." "Is that the whole of your story?" She considered for a moment. "Yes, I think that I have told you everything." "What took you to Mrs. Heredith's room in the first place?" I wanted to see her." "For what purpose? If you want me to help you, you had better be frank." "I wished to see the girl whom Mr. Phil had married." She brought out the answer hesitatingly, but the colour which flooded her thin white cheeks showed that she was aware of the implication of the admission. But Merrington was impervious to the finer feelings of the heart. He disbelieved her story from beginning to end, and was of the opinion that she was trying to hoax him with a concoction as crude as the vain imaginings of melodrama or the cinema. It was more with the intention of trapping her into a contradiction than of eliciting anything of importance that he continued his questions. "You say that you heard a noise at the window after the shot was fired. What did you imagine it to be?" "I was too nervous at the time to think anything about it, but since I have thought that it must have been someone getting out of the window." "Did you hear the window being opened?" "No, I heard nothing but the rustle as I told you. But it may have been the wind or my fear." "Did you catch a glimpse of the person in the room, whoever it was, when you were caught by the throat?" "No, I only felt the hand. It was quite dark and I could see nothing." "You are quite sure this happened to you? You are sure it is not imagination?" "Oh, no, it was too terribly real." "Did you observe anything about the revolver when you picked it up?" said Merrington after a pause. "No, except that it was bright and shining." "Nor when you placed it in your dress to carry it downstairs?" "I do not know anything about firearms. When I got downstairs I locked it away as quickly as I could." "So you picked up a revolver which had just been fired, without noticing whether the barrel was hot or cold. Is that what you wish me to believe?" "I picked it up by the handle. I seem to remember now that it was warm, but I cannot be sure. I hardly knew what I was doing at the time." Her confusion was so evident that Merrington did not think it worth while to pursue the point. "If your story is true, why have you not told it before?" he said. "If you are merely the unfortunate victim of circumstances that you claim to be, why did you not announce your innocence when I was questioning you at the moat house on the day after the murder?" The girl hesitated perceptibly before answering the question. "Perhaps I might have done so, but for your recognition of my mother," she said at length in a low tone. "I fail to see how that affected your own position." "It seemed to me then that it did," she responded in a firmer tone. "I knew that my story sounded improbable, but after learning what you knew about my mother, it seemed to me that you would be even less likely to believe me. So I thought the best thing I could do was to keep silence and trust to the truth coming to light in some other way." The recollection of the incidents of his visit to the moat house came thronging into Merrington's mind at this reply. "Did you see your mother when you got downstairs on the night of the murder?" he asked. "Not at first. She came in afterwards." "How long afterwards?" The girl, struck by a new note in his voice, looked at him with horror in her widened eyes. "I understand what you mean," she replied, "but you are wrong, quite wrong. My mother knows nothing whatever about it. She did not even know that I had been upstairs. She is as innocent as I am." "That does not carry us very far," said Merrington coldly, rising to his feet and touching a bell in front of him. "I do not believe you have told all." End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of The Hand in the Dark. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Hand in the Dark by Arthur J. Rees. Chapter 24. Strong in his conviction that the story of Hazel Rath was largely the product of an hysterical imagination, Merrington dismissed it from his mind and devoted all his energies to the search for Nepcote. The task looked a difficult one, but Merrington did not despair of accomplishing it before the day came round for the adjourned hearing of the charge against the girl. He knew that it was a difficult matter for a wanted man to remain uncaptured in a civilized community for any length of time if the pursuit was determined enough, and in this instance the military police were assisting the criminal authorities. Merrington's own plans for Nepcote's capture were based on the belief that he had not the means to get away from London unless the Heredith necklace was still in his possession. As that seemed likely enough, Nepcote's description was circulated among the pawnbrokers and jewellers with a request that anyone offering the necklace should be detained until a policeman could be called in. He also had Nepcote's former haunts watched in case the young man endeavoured to approach any of his friends or acquaintances for a loan. Having taken these steps in the hope of starving Nepcote into surrender if he was not caught in the meantime, Merrington next directed the resources at his command to putting London through a fine-tooth comb, as he expressed it, in the effort to get hold of his man. But it was to chance that he owed his first indication of Nepcote's movements since his disappearance. He was dictating official correspondence in his private room at Scotland Yard 3 days after his visit to Lewes, when a subordinate officer entered to say that a man had called who wished to see somebody in authority. It was Merrington's custom to interview callers who visited Scotland Yard on mysterious errands which they refused to disclose in the outer office. The information he received from such sources more than compensated for the occasional intrusion of criminals with grudges or bores with public grievances. The man who followed the janitor into the room was neither the one nor the other, but a weazened, white-faced Londoner with a shrewd eye and the false, cringing smile of a small shopkeeper. He explained in the strident vernacular of the Cockney that his name was Henry Hobbs. Henry 'Obbs was his own version of it, and he kept a pawnbroker's shop in the Caledonian Road. It was his intention to have called at Scotland Yard earlier, he explained, but his arrangements had been upset by a domestic event in his own household. "They've kept me running about ever since it happened," he added, bestowing a wink of subtle meaning upon the pretty typist who had been taking Merrington's correspondence. "The ladies, bless their hearts, always make a fuss over a little one." "When it is legitimate," Merrington gruffly corrected. "Miss Benson," he added, turning to the typist, who sat in a state of suspended animation over the typewriter at the word where he had left off dictating, "you can leave me for a little while and come back later. Now, my man," he went on as the door closed behind her, "I've no time to waste discussing babies. Tell me the object of your visit." The little man stood his ground with the imperturbable assurance of the Cockney. "We thought of calling it Victory Egg. Victory, because our London lads seem likely to finish off the war in double quick time, and Egg after our commander, good old Dougie Egg, whose name is every bit good enough for my baby. What do you think?" "Don't get your air off, guv'nor," Mr. Hobbs hastily protested, in some alarm at the expression of Merrington's face. "I'm coming to it fast enough, but my head is so full of this here kitty that I hardly know whether I'm standing on my head or my heels. It's like this here. A few days ago there was a young man come into my shop to pawn his waistcoat. I lent him off a crown on it, and he goes away. But yesterday afternoon he comes back to pawn a little pencil case, on which I lends him a shilling. Now, I shouldn't be surprised if this young man wasn't the young man we was warned to look out for as likely to offer a pearl necklace." "What makes you think so?" "By the description. I didn't notice him much at first, but I did the second time, p'raps because I'd just been reading over the handbill before he comes in. He looks a bit the worse for wear since it was drawn up, hadn't been shaved, and seemed down on his luck, but I should say it was the same man, even to the bits of grey on the temples. Been a bit of a dandy and a gentleman before he run to seed, I should say." "What makes you think that?" asked Merrington, who had scant belief in the theory that gentility has a hallmark of its own. "Not his white hands, they're nothing to go by. It was his clothes. I was a tailor in Windmill Street before I went in for pawnbrokering, and I know. This chap's suit hadn't been hacked out in the city, or in one of those places in Cheapside where they put notices in the window to say that the foreman cutter is the only man in the street who gets 12 quid a week. They hadn't come from Crouch End, neither. They was first-class West End garments. It's the same with clothes as it is with thoroughbred 'osses and women. You can always tell them, no matter how they've come down in the world. And it's like that with boots, too. This chap's boots hadn't been cleaned for days, but they were boots, and not 'oles to put your feet into like most people wear." "You made no effort to detain him?" "How could I? He didn't offer the necklace or say anything about jewels, so I had no reason for stopping him. I could see he was as nervous as a lady the whole time he was in the shop, so before I gave him a shilling for his pencil, I marked it with a cross as something to help the police get on his tracks in case he is the man you're after. When he left, I went to my door to see if there was a policeman in sight, but of course there wasn't. I doubt if he'd have got him, though. He was off like a shot as soon as he got the shilling, down a side street and then up another, going towards King's Cross. Here's the pencil case he pawned. I didn't bring the waistcoat, but you can have it if it's any good to you." Merrington glanced carelessly at the little silver pencil case, and after asking the pawnbroker a few questions, he permitted him to depart. Then he touched his bell and sent for Detective Caldew. Half an hour later, Caldew emerged from his chief's room in possession of the pawnbroker's story, with the addition of as much authoritative counsel as the mind of Merrington could suggest for its investigation. Caldew did not relish the task of following up the slender clue. He had not been impressed by the relation of Mr. Hobbs's supposed recognition of Nepcote, although as a detective he was aware that unlikely statements were sometimes followed by important results. But the element of luck entered largely into the elucidation of chance testimony. There were some men in Scotland Yard who could turn a seeming fairy tale into a startling fact, but there were others who failed when the probabilities were stronger. Caldew accounted himself one of these unlucky ones. But luck was with him that day. At least it seemed so to him that evening as he returned to Holborn after a long and trying afternoon spent in the squalid streets and slums of St. Pancras and Islington. The goddess of chance, bestowing her favours with true feminine caprice, had taken it into her wanton head at the last moment to accomplish for him the seemingly impossible feat of tracing the pawnbroker's marked shilling through various dirty hands to the pocket of the man who had pawned the pencil case. Whether she would grant him the last favour of all, by enabling him to prove whether this man and Nepcote were identical, was a point Caldew intended to put to the proof that night. Caldew was in high good humour with himself at such a successful day's work, and he alighted from the tram with the intention of passing a couple of hours pleasantly by treating himself to a little dinner in town before returning to Islington to complete his investigations. He wandered along from New Oxford Street to Charing Cross by way of Soho, scanning the restaurant menus as he passed with the indecisive air of a poor man unused to the privilege of paying high rates for bad food in strange surroundings. The foreign smells and greasy messes of Old Compton Street repelled his English appetite, and he did not care to mingle with the herds of suburban dwellers who were celebrating the fact that they were alive by making uncouth merriment over 3 and 6-penny table d'hôte and crude Burgundy and Chianti in the cheap glitter of Wardour Street. As a disciplined husband and father, Caldew's purse did not permit of his going further west for his refection, so when he reached Charing Cross he turned his face in the direction of Fleet Street. He had almost made up his mind in favour of a small English eating-house halfway down the Strand, when he encountered Colwyn. The private detective was wearing a worn tweed suit and soft hat, which had the effect of making a considerable alteration in his appearance. He was about to enter the eating-house, but stopped at the sight of Caldew looking in the window, and advanced to shake hands with him. "Thinking of dining here, Caldew?" he asked. "Yes," replied Caldew. "It seems a quiet place." "It certainly has that merit," responded Colwyn, glancing into the empty interior of the little restaurant. "You had better dine with me if you have nothing better to do. I should like to have a talk with you." Caldew expressed a pleased acquiescence. He had not seen the private detective since he had taken him a copy of Merrington's notes of his interview with Hazel Rath, and he wished to know whether Colwyn had made any fresh discoveries in the Heredith case. At their entrance, a waiter reclining against the cash desk sprang into supple life, and with a smile of prospective gratitude sped ahead up the staircase, casting backward glances of invitation like a gustatory siren enticing them to a place of bliss. He led them into a room overlooking the Thames Embankment, hung up their hats, took the wine card from the frame of the mirror over the mantelpiece, wrote down the order for the dinner, and disappeared downstairs to get the dishes. "It seems to me that you've been here before," said Caldew. "I always come here when I have an expedition in hand," was the response. Caldew wondered whether his companion's expedition was connected with the Heredith mystery, but before he could frame the question the waiter returned with a bottle of wine, and shortly afterwards the dinner appeared. It was not until the meal was concluded that Colwyn broached the subject which was uppermost in his guest's thoughts, by asking him if he had met with any success in his search for Nepcote. "We are still looking for him," was Caldew's guarded reply, as he accepted a cigar from his companion's case. "In Islington, for instance?" The light Colwyn held to his own cigar revealed the smile on his lips. Caldew was so surprised at this shrewd guess that his match slipped from his fingers. "What makes you think we are looking for Nepcote in Islington?" he demanded. "I am not unacquainted with the ingenious methods of Scotland Yard," was the reply. "I can see Merrington working it out with a scale map of London to help him. He is convinced that Nepcote is still in London without a penny in his pockets. Merrington asks himself what Nepcote is likely to do in such circumstances. Borrow from his friends, or attempt to cash a cheque? We will guard against that by watching his clubs and his bank. Raise funds on the necklace, if he has it? Merrington knows how to stop that by warning the pawnbrokers and jewellers. When he has done so, he has the satisfaction of feeling that his man is cut off from supplies, wandering penniless in stony-hearted London, as helpless as a babe in the wood. Where will he hide? He is a West End man, knowing little of London outside of Piccadilly, so the chances are that he will not get very far, and that his wanderings will end in surrender or starvation. But Scotland Yard cannot wait for him to surrender, and Merrington, with an imagination stimulated by the necessity of finding him, decides in favour of Islington, the so-called Merry Islington of obsequious London chroniclers, though, as far as my personal observation goes, its inhabitants are merry only when in liquor. Islington is congested, Islington contains criminals, and Islington is an ideal hiding-place. Therefore, says Merrington, let us seek our man there. "Oh, come, Mr. Colwyn, you don't put me off like that. Somebody must have told you that I was out there today." "I saw you myself. As a matter of fact, I have been looking for Nepcote in that part of London, in an area between Farrington Street and Euston." "Why there in particular? London is a wide field." "I have endeavoured to narrow it by considering the possibilities. The suburbs are unsafe, and so is the West End. The city affords no shelter for a fugitive. There remain the poorer congested areas, the docks and the East End. But that does not help us very much, because there is still a vast field left. What narrowed it considerably for me is my strong belief, taking all the circumstances into consideration, that Nepcote has not got very far from where we last saw him. What finally determined me to select Islington as a starting point for my search was that strange law of human gravitation which impels a fugitive to seek a criminal quarter for shelter. A hunted man seems to develop a keen scent for those who, like himself, are outside the law. Islington, as you are aware, has a large percentage of criminals in its population. At any rate, I am looking for Nepcote in Islington." "Although I could pick flaws in your theory, I am bound to say that you are right," said Caldew. "Nepcote is hiding in Islington, at least we think so," he cautiously added. "Good. How did you find out?" Caldew gave his companion particulars of the pawnbroker's visit to Scotland Yard that morning. "I've been looking for Mr. Hobbs's marked shilling in the small shops between King's Cross and Upper Street all the afternoon," he said. I traced it quite by accident, after I had decided to give up the attempt. One of the uniformed men at the Angel happened to tell me as a joke about a coffee-stall keeper who had gone to him in a fury that morning about a chance customer who, in his own words, had diddled him for a bob overnight. He showed the policeman a shilling he had taken from the man, and was under the impression that it was a bad one because it was marked with a cross. The policeman put the coin in his pocket and gave the man another one to get rid of him. I obtained the shilling from him, and went to see the coffee-stall keeper. His description of the man who passed it resembled Nepcote, and he added the information that the customer, after changing the shilling for a cup of coffee, had asked him where he could get a bed. The coffee-stall keeper directed him to a cheap lodging-house near the Angel. I went to his lodging-house and ascertained that a man answering to the description had slept there last night, and on leaving this morning said that he would return there for a bed tonight. I have a policeman watching the place, and I am going out there shortly to see this chap, if he comes back. Do you care to go with me?" "I'll go with pleasure," said Colwyn, who had listened to this story with close attention. "Then we'd better be getting along. But I say, don't mention this to Merrington if anything goes wrong and I don't pull it off. The old man has his knife into me over this case, and my life wouldn't be worth living if Nepcote slipped through our fingers again. I want to try and surprise him, and let him see that there are other men at Scotland Yard besides himself." "I don't think you have much to fear from Merrington," said Colwyn, laughing outright. "He is in a chastened mood at present. But you can rely on my discretion, and I hope you will get your man." "I believe I shall," returned Caldew in a confident tone. "Shall we make a start?" Colwyn paid the bill, and they set out through the darkened streets, upon which a light autumn fog was descending. The Kingsway Underground tramway carried them to the Angel, where they got off. Caldew threaded his way through the unwashed population of that centre, and turned into a side street where a swarm of draggle-tailed women were chaffering for decaying greens heaped on costers' stalls in the middle of the road. He turned again into a narrower street running off this street market, and stopped when he got to the end of it. He nudged his companion and pointed to a sign of "Good Beds" visible beneath a flare in a doorway opposite. "That's the place," he said. A policeman came up to them, looming out of the fog as suddenly as a spectre, and nodded to Caldew. "Nothing doing," he briefly announced. "I've watched the place ever since, but he hasn't been in." "All right," said Caldew. "You can leave it to me now. I shan't need you any longer. Good night." "Good night, and good night to you, Mr. Colwyn," the policeman responded, turning with a smile to the private detective. "I didn't recognize you at first because of the fog. I didn't know you were in this job." "And I hope that you won't mention it now that you do know," interposed Caldew hastily. "Not me. I'm not one of the talking sort." The policeman nodded again in a friendly fashion, and disappeared down the side street. The two detectives stood there watching, screened from passing observation in the deep doorway of an empty shop. The flare which swung in the doorway opposite permitted them to take stock of everybody who entered the lodging-house in quest of a bed. By its light they could even decipher beneath the large sign of "Good Beds, 8d." a smaller sign which added, "Or 2 persons a shilling," which, by its careful wording, seemed to hint that those entranced in love's young dream might seek the seclusion of the bowers within unhindered by awkward questions of conventional morality, and by its triumphant vindication of the time-worn sentiment that love conquers all, tended to reassure democracy that the difference between West End hotels and Islington lodging-houses was one of price only. But the visitors to the lodging-house that night suggested thraldom to less romantic tyrants than Cupid. Drink, disease, and want were the masters of the ill-favoured men who shambled within at intervals, thrusting the price of a bed through a pigeon-hole at the entrance, receiving a dirty ticket in exchange. These transactions and the faces of the frowsy lodgers were clearly visible to the watchers across the road, but none of the men resembled Nepcote. Shortly after 10 o'clock raindrops began to fall sluggishly through the fog, and, as if that were the signal for closing, the figure of a man appeared in the lodging-house doorway and proceeded to extinguish the flare. "We had better go over," Caldew said. They walked across the oozing road, and he accosted the man in the doorway. "You're closing early tonight," he observed. The man desisted from his occupation to stare at them. He was an ill-favoured specimen of an immortal soul, with a bloated face, a pendulous stomach, and a week's growth of beard on his dirty chin. A short black pipe was thrust upside down in his mouth, and his attire consisted of a shirt open at the neck, a pair of trousers upheld by no visible support, and a pair of old slippers. Apparently satisfied from his prolonged inspection of the two visitors that they were not in search of lodgings, he replied in a surly tone, "What the hell's that to do with you? If you let us know when you're coming, we'll keep open all night, I don't think." Caldew pushed past him without deigning to parley, and opened a door adjoining the entrance pigeon-hole. A man was seated at the table within, reckoning the night's takings by the light of a candle. It was strange to see one so near the grave counting coppers with such avid greed. His withered old face was long and yellow, and the prominent cheekbones and fallen cheeks gave it a coffin-like shape. His sunken little eyes were almost lost to view beneath bushy overhanging eyebrows, and from his shrunken mouth a single black tusk protruded upward, as though bent on reaching the tip of a long sharp nose. He started up from his accounts in fright as the door was flung open, and thrust a hand in a drawer near him, perhaps in quest of a weapon. Then he recognized Caldew, and smiled the propitiatory smile of one who had reason to fear the forces of authority. "That chap you're after didn't turn up tonight," he mumbled. "You're closing very early. He may come yet." "'Tain't no use if he do. He won't get in. All my regulars is in, and I ain't going to waste light waiting for a chance eightpence. P'raps you'd like to see the room where he slept last night?" Caldew nodded, and the lodging-house keeper, calling in the man they had seen closing the door, directed him to show the gentleman the single room. The man lit a candle and took the detectives upstairs to the top of the house. He opened the door of a very small and filthy room, with sloping ceiling and a broken window. A piece of dirty rag which had been hung across the window flapped noisily as the rain beat through the hole. The man held up the candle to enable the visitors to see the apartment to the greatest advantage. "We charge twopence more for this bedroom because it's a single doss," he said, not without a touch of pride in his tone. "And well worth the money," remarked Caldew. "Look here, Mr. Funny-Sides, I didn't bring you up here to listen to no sarcastical remarks," retorted the man, with the sudden fury of a heavy drinker. "If you've seen enough, you'd better clear out. I want to go to bed." "You had better behave yourself if you don't want to get into trouble," counselled Caldew. "So you're a rouser, are you? Damned if I didn't think so as soon as I clapped eyes on you. But you've got nothing against me, so I don't care a snap of my fingers for you. You'd better hurry up." Caldew took no further notice of him, but joined Colwyn in examining the room. They found nothing giving any indication of its last tenant. The only articles in the room were a bed, a broken chair, and a beam of wood shoved diagonally against one of the walls, which threatened to fall in on the first windy night and bury the wretched bed and its occupant. After a brief search, they turned away and went downstairs. The door was immediately slammed behind them, and the turning of the lock and the rattling of a chain told them that the place was closed for the night. Pulling up his coat collar in an effort to shield himself from the persistence of the rain, Caldew expressed his disappointment at the failure of the night's expedition in a bitter jibe at his bad luck. At first he thought he would wait a little longer on the watch. Then he changed his mind as he glanced at the unpromising night, and decided that it wasn't worth while. He lived in Edgware Road, so he shook hands with Colwyn and set out for the Underground at King's Cross. Colwyn returned to the Angel to look for a taxicab. The fog was lifting, and crowds were emerging from the cinemas and a music hall with the fatigue look of people who have paid in vain to be entertained. Outside the music hall some taxicabs were waiting for the more opulent patrons of refined vaudeville, who had been drawn within by the rare promise of an intellectual baboon, reputed to have the brains of a statesman, which shared the honours of top of the bill with two charming sisters from a West End show. The drivers of the taxicabs said they were engaged, and uncivilly refused to drive the detective to Ludgate Circus. A Bermondsey omnibus came plunging through the fog, scattering the filth of the road on the hurrying pleasure-goers, and stopped at the corner to add to its grievous load of damp humanity. Those already in the darkened interior sat stiffly motionless, like corpses in a mortuary wagon, as the newcomers scrambled in, scattering mud and water over them, feeling for the overhead straps. Colwyn did not attempt to enter. Even a Smithfield tram-car would be better than the interior of a bus on a wet night. An ancient four-wheeler went past, crawling dejectedly homeward. The driver checked his gaunt horse at the sight of Colwyn standing on the curbstone, and raised an interrogative whip. He added a vocal appeal for hire based on the incredible assumption that a man must live, which he proclaimed with a whip elevated to the sodden heavens, calling on a god, invisible in the fog, to bear witness that he hadn't turned a wheel that night. The phrasing of the appeal helped Colwyn to recall that it was the same cabman who had accosted Philip Heredith and himself on the night they had motored to the moat house. He engaged the cab and entered the dark interior. The whip, which had been uplifted in pious aspiration, fell in benedictory thanks on the bare ribs of the horse. The equipage jolted over the Angel crossing into the squalid precincts of St. John's Street. In a short time the overpowering smell of slaughtered beasts announced the proximity of Smithfield. The cab turned down Charterhouse Street towards Farrington Market, and a little later pulled up under the archway at Ludgate Circus. "I leaves it to you, sir," said the cabman in a husky whisper. His expectant palm closed rigidly on the silver coins, and his whip fell on the lean sides of the horse with a crack like a pistol shot as he wheeled round, leaving the detective standing in the road. The fog had almost cleared away, but the unlighted streets were plunged in deep gloom, through which groups of late wayfarers passed dimly and melted vaguely, like ghosts in the darkness of eternity. As Colwyn was about to enter the corridor leading to his chambers, a man brushed past him in the doorway. There was something about the figure which struck the detective as familiar, and he walked quickly after him. By the light of the departing cab he saw his face. It was Nepcote. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of The Hand in the Dark. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Hand in the Dark by Arthur J. Rees. Chapter 25. In that swift, unexpected recognition, Colwyn observed that the man for whom they had been searching looked pale and worn. He stood quite still in the doorway, his breath coming and going in quick gasps. "We have been looking for you, Captain Nepcote," Colwyn said. "I am aware of that. I have been waiting to see you, but I could get nobody to answer my ring." "My man is out. You had better come upstairs to my rooms." He led the way to the lift at the end of the corridor. When they reached the rooms, Colwyn switched on the electric light. Nepcote dropped wearily into a chair, and for the first time Colwyn was able to see his face clearly. He looked very ill, there could be no doubt of that. His face was haggard and unshaven, his clothing was soiled, his attitude one of utter dejection. He crouched in the chair, breathing hurriedly, with one hand pressed to his right side as though in pain. Occasionally he coughed, a short, high-pitched cough which made him wince. "You had better drink this before you talk," Colwyn said. He handed him a glass of brandy and water. Nepcote seized it eagerly and gulped it down. "I've caught a bad chill," he said in a hoarse, unnatural voice. "I couldn't carry on any longer. That's why I came to see you tonight. But I'd given up hopes. I was ringing for some time." "You came to surrender yourself?" "Yes, I am fed up, absolutely. I was a fool to bolt. I've had a horrible time, sleeping out of doors and in verminous lodging houses, with the police after me at every turn. I stuck it as long as I could, but to-day I was ill, and when I saw a policeman watching the lodging house where I meant to sleep tonight, I felt that I had to give in." "Why have you come to me instead of going to the police?" "I thought I would get more consideration from you. I know you are searching for Mrs. Heredith's necklace. Here it is." He drew from his pocket a small parcel wrapped in dirty tissue paper and put it on the table. The untidy folds fell apart, exposing the missing necklace, but the diamond was missing from the antique clasp. "The diamond is in that," he said, placing a small cardboard box beside the pearls. "I wish I had never seen the cursed thing." "How do you come to have Mrs. Heredith's necklace?" Nepcote hesitated before replying. "I was terribly upset by Mrs. Heredith's death," he said at length. "I knew her before she married Phil Heredith. We were old friends." The inconsequence of this statement convinced Colwyn that he was seeking time to frame an evasive answer. "If that is all you have to say, it is useless to prolong this interview," he coldly remarked. I am going to tell you where I got the necklace," Nepcote said with downcast eyes. "Mrs. Heredith gave it to me." "Why did Mrs. Heredith give you her necklace?" "She asked me to raise some money on it for her." "For what purpose?" "I cannot say. Pretty women always need money. It may have been for a dress, or bridge, or old debts. She brought me the necklace one day and asked me to get some money on it. I suggested that she should apply to her husband, but she said she needed some extra money and she did not wish him to know." "And you complied with her request?" "I did, after she had pressed me several times. I am always a fool where women are concerned. I promised to raise money on the necklace in London for her. That was the beginning of my troubles. But who could have foreseen? How was I to know what was going to happen?" He sat brooding for a space with gloomy eyes, like a man repelled by the menace of events, then burst out wildly. "I'm in a horrible position. Who will believe me? My God, what a fool I've been!" "You're doing yourself no good by going on like this," Colwyn said. "You are keeping something back. My advice to you is to be quite frank with me and tell me everything." "You must give me a few minutes first to think it over," responded Nepcote. He cast a doubtful glance at the detective and relapsed into another brooding silence. "Before you say anything more, it is my duty to inform you of my own connection with the case," said Colwyn. "There has been an arrest for the murder, as no doubt you are aware, but the family are not satisfied that the right person has been arrested. You are suspected." "Do they think that I murdered Violet? Oh, I never dreamt of this," he added, as Colwyn remained silent. "I thought that you and the police were searching for me because of the necklace. It is even worse than I thought. I will now tell you all. Perhaps you will then help me, for I am innocent." Until that moment he had flung out his protestations with an excited impetuosity which told of a mind suffering under a grievous burden, though it was impossible to determine whether that state of feeling arose from anxiety or conscious guilt. His quietness now was in the oddest contrast. It was as though he had been sobered by his realization of the difficulty of convincing an outsider of his innocence of a foul crime, in which he was deeply entangled by an appalling web of circumstance. He began by explaining, vaguely enough, his past friendship with the murdered girl. He had first met her in London 2 years before. Their relations, as he depicted them, conveyed a common story of a casual acquaintance developed in the familiar attitude of secluded restaurants, with dances and theatres later on. His story of this phase had all the familiar elements which make up the setting of a modern sophisticated love episode, into which a man and a girl enter with their eyes open. In the masculine way, Nepcote refrained from saying anything which could hurt the dead girl's reputation, but it was his reticence and reservations which completed the story for his listener. He said that their flirtation ceased when Violet became engaged to Philip Heredith. On his own showing, he then acted sensibly enough in a delicate situation, and was afterwards reluctant to accept the invitation to the moat house. With one of his reticent evasions, he slurred over his reasons for changing his mind, but Colwyn guessed that it was due to the feminine disinclination to bury an old romance. Violet had probably written and asked him to come. He conveyed to Colwyn a picture of the state of things existing at the moat house when he arrived. It was an unconscious revelation on his part of a giddy, shallow girl hastily marrying a wealthy young man for his money, quickly bored by the dull decorum of English country life, sighing for her former existence, for the gay distractions of her irresponsible London days. It seemed that in this frame of mind she welcomed Nepcote as a dear link with the past, and sought his society with a frequency which had its embarrassments. Of course there was nothing in it. Nepcote was fiercely insistent on that. She was a bored, poor girl, and liked to talk about old times with her old friend. But it was awkward, devilish awkward, in a country house full of idle people and curious servants with nothing to do but use their eyes. She had taken him aside to tell him of her little troubles. Miss Heredith did not think her good enough for Phil, she was sure of that. They had the vicar and old frumps in to tea, and she had to listen to their piffle. They all went to bed soon after 10, just when people were beginning to wake up in London and go out for the night. And she had to go to church on Sunday because it was expected of her. Did he ever hear of such rot? And so on. It seemed that everything in her life bored her. Of course Phil worshipped her, but that didn't help her much. How could it, Nepcote asked, fixing his burning glance on his listener, when she had only married him for his coin? It appeared he had given her such counsel as his worldly experience suggested. He told her to get Phil to take her up to London now and again for a change. He advised her to stand no nonsense from anybody, pointing out to her that she was the future Lady Heredith, and, within limits, could do practically what she liked. These intimate details of the confidences between them brought Nepcote to the vital point of his possession of the necklace. He now admitted that his former story was untrue. The actual truth was that he had needed some money badly for his gambling debts. He told Violet of his position, and asked her had she any money to lend him. She had not, and rather than ask Phil, she had, for old friendship's sake, offered him her necklace to raise money on, or to sell outright the diamond in the clasp. He accepted her offer, and went up to London on the following day to try and sell the diamond. Wendover's card had been given him by a brother officer in France as that of a man who gave a good price for jewels without asking too many questions. But the diamond merchant had not lived up to his reputation. He had refused to look at the diamond. He had been horribly rude, treating him as though he was a pickpocket, and had practically ordered him out of his office. In fact, his whole attitude was so suspicious that Nepcote decided it would be better to leave his gambling debts owing than run the risk of trying to raise money on a married woman's jewels. He returned to the moat house, leaving the necklace locked in his desk at his flat. At this point Nepcote ceased speaking again, interrupted by a paroxysm of coughing, and when it passed his eyes turned towards the window, as though he were listening to the gentle patter of rain on the panes. For a space the two men sat with no sound in the room except Nepcote's laboured breathing. When he did resume, he spoke with a quickened emphasis, like a man aware that he was entering upon the part of his narrative most incredible of belief. "It happened 3 nights later," he said. "I was in my room, writing some letters before retiring, when I heard a light and hurried tap at my door. When I opened it, Violet was standing there. She stepped quickly inside. Before I could express my opinion of her reckless foolishness, she burst into passionate sobs and reproaches. It was all my fault. That was the burden of her reproach between her sobs. It was some time before I could get out of her what was wrong. Then she told me that Sir Philip had asked her to wear the necklace at some dance we were to attend on the next night. It was then that I learnt that the necklace had been given to Violet by Sir Philip as a wedding present. Violet attached such little value to the gift that she had given the necklace to me, thinking it would not be missed. But she had found out her mistake that night. It was in the presence of Phil and Miss Heredith that Sir Philip had asked her to wear it. Violet tried to get out of it by saying that the pearls were dull and the necklace wanted resetting. On hearing this, Miss Heredith had gone out of the room and returned with Mr. Musard, an old family friend who had arrived that day on a short visit. He is a connoisseur in jewels, and Miss Heredith asked his advice about the necklace. Musard told her that the pearls had long needed some treatment technically known as skinning, and he offered to take the necklace to London 2 days later and get it done by an expert. Violet accepted the offer, and then promised Sir Philip that she would wear the necklace at the party. She slipped upstairs to see me as soon as she dared. She was greatly relieved when she learnt that I had not parted with the necklace, and she wanted me to go up to London and bring it back so that she could wear it at the party. I was willing to do so, but I doubted whether I would be able to get back in time. The local train service had been restricted on account of the war, and the only train I could catch back did not reach Heredith until 7:30. It was Violet who hit on the plan. The big thing, the vital thing for her, she pointed out, was to have the necklace in time to give to Musard before he went to London. She said she could easily get out of going to the dance by pretending to have one of her bad headaches, and she did not wish to meet Mrs. Wayne again. Her idea was that I should pretend I had been recalled to France, delay my departure until the afternoon train to prevent suspicion, and return secretly with the necklace. She said that the afternoon train reached London at 5:25, which would give me 35 minutes to take a taxi to my flat, get the necklace, and catch the return express at 6 o'clock. I was to leave the train at Weydene Junction, where nobody was likely to recognize me, and walk across country to the moat house. She expected that by the time I reached the house the others would have left for the Waynes, so the coast would be clear. I was to enter the house by a little unused door at the back of the left wing, which she would leave unlocked for me, and wait at the foot of the staircase until she came down. I did not like this plan because of the risk, but Violet grew almost hysterical when I objected to it. She said there was no danger, and it was her only chance of safety. She believed that Phil suspected something because he had looked at her strangely when they were talking about the necklace downstairs. I put that down to nervousness on her part, but I realized she must have the necklace, so I gave in and said I would do as she wished. I have since bitterly regretted that I did not go openly to London and back, even at the risk of a little idle curiosity. I announced my recall and departure next morning at the breakfast table, and returned to London by the afternoon train. I drove to Sherryman Street, got the necklace, and returned to Victoria just in time to catch the 6 o'clock express. I left the train at Weydene and walked across the fields to the moat house. It was quite dark when I reached there. I crossed the back bridge over the moat and went to the door in the left wing as we had arranged. To my surprise, it was locked. I waited outside the door, expecting Violet to come down. Everything was silent, so I thought the others must have started for the dance. But the time went on, and nobody came. Then I decided to creep round the side of the wing and see if there was a light in Violet's bedroom. At that moment I heard a loud scream from somewhere upstairs, followed by a deafening report. I had no idea what had happened, but I knew that I must not be found there, so I slipped back the way I had come. I ran along the outside of the moat wall, making for the wood in front of the house. As I passed Violet's window, I looked up, and it was in darkness. I suppose that was why I did not connect the shot or the scream with her. I plunged through the woods till I came to the carriage drive. From there the front of the moat house was visible to me. I could see lights flashing and people moving hurriedly about. After I had stood there for some time, I saw a man hurrying across the moat house bridge in my direction, so I went back into the wood and hid behind a tree. The man stopped as he walked along the carriage drive and looked towards the tree where I was crouching. He called out, "Who is there?" I recognized his voice. It was Tufnell, the butler. I thought I was discovered, and crept into some undergrowth, but in a moment he walked on. I remained hidden in the undergrowth for some time, an hour or more. Once I heard footsteps crunching on the gravel path, then all was silent again. After waiting for some time longer, I decided to walk back to Weydene and return to London, but I made such a wide detour for fear of being seen that I lost my way, and it was nearly midnight when I found myself at Rainchester on the main line, just in time to catch the last train to London. It was a terrible shock to me when I opened my paper the next morning and read about poor Violet's murder. I had never thought of anything like that. At first I could think of nothing but her terrible end. But then it occurred to me that my own position would be awkward if the loss of the necklace was discovered. As the paper said nothing about the necklace, I concluded that it had not been missed, but I knew the police would be searching for clues and might discover the loss at any moment. I knew it was dangerous for me to keep it in my possession, so I decided to get rid of it without delay. I thought at first of returning it anonymously, but I immediately abandoned that idea as too dangerous. Then I thought of dropping it into the river. It occurred to me, however, that if by any chance the police discovered that the necklace had been given to me, and I couldn't produce it if I were questioned, I should be in a worse fix still. So I tried to think of a safe hiding place where I could lay my hands on it in case of necessity. I could think of none. Time went on, and before I had decided what to do with the thing, my man came along and said it was time to catch the boat train. So in the end I put the necklace into my pocket and took it to France with me. It seemed as safe there as anywhere else for the time being. I was only going to the base, so I saw the London papers every day. I was very relieved when I read of the arrest of Hazel Rath for the murder. I returned to London feeling reasonably safe, though it seemed strange to me that the loss of the necklace had not been discovered. I thought everything was found out when you and that Scotland Yard detective visited my flat. But Merrington seemed to have no suspicions of me, and I was just beginning to think I was finally safe when he remarked that the police knew of the missing necklace. I started, and that gave me away, to you at all events. I saw you glance at Wendover's card as it fell on the table, and I knew that you suspected me. After you had both left, I had a bad half-hour. I could see I was in a dangerous fix. You were aware of the address of the diamond merchant to whom I had gone, and who no doubt would be able to identify me. I had made my own position worse by lying about the War Office telegram, as could easily be proved. There was also the possibility that the police might find out about my return to Heredith on the night of the murder. I did not then see what all these facts portended for me, though I do now. But I feared arrest for the theft of the necklace, with the alternatives of imprisonment if I kept silent, or facing a horrible scandal if I told the truth. I was not prepared for either. I slept at an hotel that night because I feared arrest, but next morning, early, I returned to the flat to exchange my khaki for a civilian suit. After thinking over things during the night, I had come to the conclusion that I had most to fear from you, and I decided to watch you. If you did not visit Wendover's place during the day, it seemed to me that I might be alarming myself needlessly. You know what happened. I bolted when I saw you emerge from the buildings, and wandered about for hours, not knowing what best to do. When I discovered that I had no money, nothing in my pockets except that cursed necklace which I had taken with me because I knew the flat would be searched, I decided to return to the flat for the money I had left behind in my other clothes. I was too late. When I reached Sherryman Street, I saw two men watching the flat from the garden of the square opposite, and I knew I would be arrested if I went inside. What's the use of talking about what followed? I hadn't the ghost of a show from the start. Do you think you know anything about London? Believe me, you don't until you have been cast adrift in it with empty pockets. It's a city of vampires and stony hearts, a seething inhuman hell where you can wander till you drop and die without anyone giving a pitying glance, much less a helping hand. Even a man's guardian angel deserts him. It doesn't take a man very long to get to the gutter, to fall lower and lower until there's nothing but the Thames Embankment or the mortuary in front of him. I've had my eyes opened. I've talked to some of these poor devils in this Christian city. But what's the good of telling you this? I have been down to the gutter myself the last few days, falling each day to lower depths, tramping, hungry and footsore in the midst of herds of respectable human brutes, slinking away from the eye of every policeman, pawning clothes for the price of a verminous bed, to lie awake all night, knowing that I would be murdered by the vulture-faced degenerates sleeping in the same hovel if they had caught a glimpse of the necklace. How many wild schemes have I planned in the night for raising money on the necklace in the morning! Once I went into a pawnshop, but the pawnbroker's eyes glittered when I spoke of pearls, and I got away as quickly as I could. I suppose there was a reward, and he was on the lookout for me. One way and another I've been through hell. I feel like a man in a fever. I was drenched through yesterday, and I've had no food for 24 hours. He ceased and sat staring into vacancy as though he were again passing through the horror of his wanderings. Then another fit of coughing seized him, prolonged and violent. When it had subsided, he looked at Colwyn with bloodshot eyes. "I feel pretty bad," he said weakly. That fact had been apparent to the detective for some time past. Nepcote's frequent fits of coughing and a peculiar nasal intensity of utterance suggested symptoms of pneumonia. As Colwyn lifted the telephone receiver to summon a doctor, the thought occurred to him that, if the immediate problem of the disposal of Nepcote had been settled by his illness, his inability to answer questions necessitated his own return to the moat house without delay. In any case, that course was inevitable after what he had just heard. It was only at the place where the murder had been committed that he could hope to judge between the probabilities of Nepcote's strange story and Hazel Rath's confession. It was there, unless he was very much mistaken, that the final solution of the Heredith mystery must be sought. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of The Hand in the Dark. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Hand in the Dark by Arthur J. Rees. Chapter 26. It was late afternoon when Colwyn reached Heredith the following day. The brief English summer, dying under the intolerable doom of evanescence for all things beautiful, presented the spectacle of creeping decay in a hectic flare of russet and crimson, like a withered woman striving to stave off the inevitable with pitiful dyes and rouge. In this scene the moat house was in perfect harmony, attuned by its own decrepitude to the general dissolution of its surroundings. Its aspect was a shuttered front of sightlessness, a brick and stone blindness to the changes of the seasons and the futility of existence. The terraced gardens had put on the death tints of autumn, but the house showed an aged indifference to the tricks of enslaved nature at the bidding of creation. Colwyn's ring at the door was answered by Milly Saker, whose rustic stare at the sight of him was followed by an equally broad grin of recognition. She ushered him into the hall and went in search of Miss Heredith. In a moment or two Miss Heredith appeared. She looked worn and ill, but she greeted Colwyn with a gracious smile and a firm handshake, and took him to the library. Refreshments were brought in, and while Colwyn sipped a glass of wine, his hostess uttered the opening conversational commonplaces of an English lady. Had he a pleasant journey down? The roads were very good for motoring at that time of year, and the country was looking beautiful. Many people thought it was the best time for seeing the country. It was a fine autumn, but the local farmers thought the signs pointed to a hard winter. Thus she chatted until the glass of sherry was finished. Then she lapsed into silence, with a certain expectancy in her mild glance, as though waiting for Colwyn to announce the object of his visit. "I presume you have come down to see Phil?" she said, as Colwyn did not speak. "Unfortunately, he is not at home," she went on, answering her own question in the feminine manner. "He has gone to Devon with Mr. Musard for a few days. It was my idea. I wanted him taken out of himself. He's moping terribly, and of course that is bad for him. I hope to persuade him to go with Vincent for a complete change when this terrible business is finished." Again her eye sought his. "When do you expect them to return?" "Tomorrow night. Phil would not stay away longer. He has been expecting to hear from you. Can you stay till then?" "Quite easily. In fact, I came down prepared to stop for a day or so. I have some further inquiries to make which will occupy me during that time." "Then of course you will stay with us, Mr. Colwyn." "You are very kind, but I do not wish to trouble you. I have engaged a room at the inn." "It is no trouble. I will send a man down for your things. Phil would not like you to stay at the inn. Neither should I." Miss Heredith rose as she spoke. "Please do whatever you wish, Mr. Colwyn. I quite understand that you have work to do and wish to be alone." "Thank you. Then I shall stay." Colwyn sat for a while after she had left him, forming his plans. He was grateful to her for a tact which had not transgressed beyond the limits of unspoken thought during their brief interview, but he was more pleased with the fortuitous absence of Phil and Musard at that period of his investigations. He welcomed the opportunity of working unquestioned, because he was not prepared to disclose the statements of Nepcote and Hazel Rath to any of the inmates of the moat house until he had tested the feasibility of both stories in the setting of the crime. "It has all turned out very fortunately so far," was the thought which arose in his mind. "And now to work." He glanced at his watch. It was nearly 4 o'clock. His immediate plans were a walk to Weydene and another observation of the bedroom which Mrs. Heredith had occupied in the left wing. He decided to leave his investigation of the room until later, so as to have the advantage of the waning daylight in his walk across the fields. When he returned to the moat house it was dark and on the stroke of the dinner hour. That meal he took with Sir Philip and Miss Heredith in the faded state of the big dining room, 3 decorous figures at a brightly lit oasis of snowy linen and silver, with a sober black of Tufnell in the background. Sir Philip greeted Colwyn with his tired smile of welcome. He seemed somewhat frailer, but quite animated as he pressed a special claret on his guest and told him, like a child telling of a promised treat, that he was dining out the following night. He insisted on giving the wonderful news in detail. He had yielded to the solicitations of an old friend, Lord Granger, the ambassador, who had just returned to Granger Park after 5 years' absence from England, and would take no denial. But it was Alethea's doing. She had arranged it all. "I'm going to put back the clock of time," he said, with a feeble chuckle. "Put the hands right back." "I think it will do him good, don't you, Mr. Colwyn?" said Miss Heredith, with a wistful smile. "I have no doubt of it," said Colwyn, with an answering smile. "A meeting with an old friend is always a good thing. Are you going with Sir Philip?" "Oh, yes, I wouldn't go without her," said the baronet, with the helpless look of senility. "You're going, aren't you, Alethea?" "Of course, Philip," was the gentle response. This conversation, slight and desultory as it was, gave sufficient indication to the detective of the heavy burden Miss Heredith was bearing. The baronet could talk of nothing else during the remainder of the dinner, and when the meal was finished he begged his guest to excuse him, as he wished to obtain a good night's rest to fortify him against the excitement of the coming outing. With an apologetic smile at Colwyn, his sister followed him from the room. The old butler busied himself at the sideboard as Colwyn remained seated at the table sipping his wine. His movements were so deliberate as to convey a suspicion that he was in no hurry to leave the room, and the glances he shot at Colwyn whenever he moved out of the range of his vision carried with them the additional suggestion that the detective was the unconscious cause of his slowness. More than once after these backward glances he opened his lips as though to speak, but did not do so. It was Colwyn who broke the silence. "Tufnell," he said. "Yes, sir." The butler deposited a dish on the sideboard and stepped quickly to the detective's chair. "I want to ask you a question or two. It was you who found the back door of the left wing unlocked on the night of the murder, was it not?" The butler gravely bowed, but did not speak. "What made you try the door? Did you suspect that it was unlocked?" "No, it was just chance that caused me to turn the handle. I am so used to locking up the house at nights that I did it without thinking. I certainly never expected to find it unlocked, and the key in the inside of the door. That was quite a surprise to me. I have often wondered since who could have unlocked it and left the key in the door." "You told me last time I was here that this door is usually locked and the key kept in the housekeeper's apartments. I suppose there is no doubt about that?" "Not the least, sir. The key is hanging there now with a lot of others. Nobody ever thinks of using the door. That is why I was so astonished to find it open that night." "If the key was hanging with a number of others, it might have been taken some time before and not be missed?" "That's just it, sir. It might not have been missed by now if I had not discovered it that night." "What time was it when you found it?" "Shortly before 6 o'clock. Getting dusk, but not dark." "You are quite sure you locked the door after finding it open?" "There can be no doubt of that, sir. The lock is stiff to turn, and I tried the handle of the door to make sure that I had locked it properly." "Did you return the key to the housekeeper's apartments immediately?" "I intended to return it after dinner, but I forgot all about it in the excitement and confusion. It was still in my pocket when I informed Mr. Musard about it." "Here is another question, Tufnell, and I want you to think well before answering it. Do you think it would have been possible for anybody to enter the house and gain the left wing unobserved while the household was at dinner that night?" "I have asked myself that question several times since, sir, feeling a certain amount of responsibility. It would have been difficult, because the windows of the downstairs bedrooms of the left wing were all locked. There was always the chance of some of the servants seeing anybody crossing the hall on the way to the staircase, unless the person watched and waited for an opportunity." Colwyn nodded as though dismissing the subject, but the butler lingered. Perhaps it was his realization of the implication of his last words which gave him the courage to broach the matter which had been occupying his mind. "Might I ask you a question, sir?" he hesitatingly commenced. "What is it?" "It's about the young woman who has been arrested, sir. Is there any likelihood that she will be proved innocent?" "You must have some particular reason for asking me that question, Tufnell." "Well, sir, I am aware that Mr. Philip thinks her innocent." "So you told me when I was down here before, but that is not the reason for your question. You had better be frank." "I wish to be frank, sir, but I am in a difficulty. I have learnt something which seems to have a bearing on this young woman's position, which I think you ought to know, but I have to consider my duty to the family. It was something I overheard." "If it throws the slightest light on this crime, it is your duty to reveal it," the detective responded gravely. "You are aware that I have been called into the case by Mr. Heredith because he is not convinced of Hazel Rath's guilt." "Quite so, sir. For that reason I have been trying to make up my mind to confide in you. When you have heard what I have to say you will understand how hard it is. It relates to Mr. Philip, sir. Since his illness I have been worried about his health, because he is so changed that I feared he might go mad with grief. He hardly speaks a word to anybody, but sometimes I have seen him muttering to himself. The night before he went away with Mr. Musard he did not come down to dinner. Miss Heredith was going to send a servant to his room in case he had not heard the gong, but I offered to go myself. When I reached his bedroom I heard the most awful sobbing possible to imagine. Then, through the partly open door, I heard Mr. Philip call on God Almighty to make somebody suffer as he had suffered. He mentioned a name." "Whose name?" The butler looked fearfully towards the closed door as though he suspected eavesdroppers, and then brought it out with an effort. "Captain Nepcote, sir." Colwyn had expected that name. Nepcote's statement on the previous night had led him to believe that Philip Heredith had suspected Nepcote's relations with his wife, but could not bring himself to disclose that when he sought assistance. It was Colwyn's experience that nothing was so rare as complete frankness from people who came to him for help. It was part of the ingrained reserve of the English mind, the sensitive dread of gossip or scandal, to keep something back at such moments. The average person was so swaddled by limitations of intelligence as to be incapable of understanding that suppressed facts were bound to come to light sooner or later if they affected the matter of the partial confidence. Of course, there was sometimes the alternative of a reticence which was intended to mislead. If that entered into the present case, it was an additional complication. "What interpretation did you place on these overheard words?" he asked the butler. "Did you suppose that they referred to the murder?" "Well, sir," the butler hesitated, as if at a loss to express himself. "It was not for me to draw conclusions, sir, but I could not help thinking over what I had heard. I know Mr. Philip believed the young woman to be innocent, and Mrs. Heredith was shot with Captain Nepcote's revolver." "I see. You had no other thought in your mind?" "No, sir. What else could I think?" The butler's meek tones conveyed such an inflection of surprise that Colwyn was convinced that he, at all events, had no suspicion of the secret between Mrs. Heredith and Nepcote. "Your confidence is quite safe with me, Tufnell," the detective said after a pause, "but I cannot answer your question at present." "Very well, sir." The butler turned to the sideboard again without further remark, and left the dining room a few minutes later. Colwyn went to his room shortly afterwards, and occupied himself for a couple of hours in going through his notes of the case. It was his intention to defer his visit to the bedroom in the left wing until the household had retired, so as to be free from the curious speculations and tittle-tattle of the servants. The moat house kept country hours, and when he had finished his writing and descended from his room, he found the ground floor in darkness. A clock somewhere in the stillness chimed solemnly as he walked swiftly across the hall. Its strokes finished proclaiming the hour of 11 as he mounted the staircase of the left wing. The loneliness of the deserted wing was like a moving, shuddering thing in the desolation of the silence and darkness. It was as though the echoing corridor and the empty rooms were whispering, with the appeal of the forgotten, for friendly human companionship and light to disperse the horror of sinister shapes and brooding shadows which lurked in the abode of murder. Colwyn entered the bedroom where Mrs. Heredith had been murdered, and by the ray of his electric torch crossed to the bedside and switched on the light. He stood there motionless for a while, trying to picture the manner and the method of the murder. If Hazel Rath had spoken the truth, the murderer had stood where he was now standing when the girl entered the room in the darkness. Had the light from the corridor, streaming through the open door, revealed her approaching figure to him? How long had he been there in the darkness, waiting for the moment to kill the woman on the bed? If Nepcote was the murderer, he must have entered almost immediately before, because he could not have reached the moat house until nearly 7:30, and the shot was fired at 20 minutes to 8. How had he known that Mrs. Heredith was there alone in the darkness? A secret assignation might have been the explanation if the time had been after instead of before the household's departure for the evening. But even the most wanton pair of lovers would hesitate to indulge their passion while the risk of chance discovery and exposure was so great. As he pondered over the two stories, Colwyn did not attempt to shut his eyes to the fact that Hazel, on her own showing, fitted into the crime more completely than Nepcote. She had ample opportunities to slip into the room and murder the woman who had supplanted her. She had really strengthened the case against herself by the damaging admission that she had sought Mrs. Heredith's room in secret just before the crime was committed. Her explanation of the scream and the shot was so improbable as to sound incredible. It was not to be wondered that Scotland Yard preferred to believe that it was the apparition of the frantic girl, revolver in hand, which had caused her affrighted victim to utter one wild scream before the shot was fired which ended her life. But Colwyn had never allowed himself to be swayed too much by circumstance. Appearances were not always a safe guide in the complicated tangle of human affairs. Things were forever happening which left experience wide-eyed with astonishment. The contradictions of human nature persisted in all human acts. In this moat house mystery, the grimmest paradox of his brilliant career, Colwyn was determined not to accept the presumption of the facts until he had satisfied himself that no other interpretation was possible. His subtle mind had been challenged by a finger-post of doubt in the written evidence, a finger-post so faint as to be passed unnoticed by other eyes, but sufficiently warning to his clearer vision to cause him to pause midway in the broad track of circumstantial evidence and look around him for a concealed path. It was the point he had mentioned to Caldew at his chambers after reading the copy of the coroner's depositions which Merrington had lent him. While perusing them he had been struck by a curious fact. The medical evidence stated that the cause of death was a small punctured wound not larger than a threepenny piece, but added the information that the hole in the gown of the dead woman was much larger, about the diameter of a half-crown. The Government pathologist had formed the opinion that the revolver must have been held very close to the body to account for the larger scorched hole. That inference was obvious, but Colwyn saw more in the two holes than that. It seemed to him that the live ring of flame caused by the close-range shot must have been extinguished by the murderer, or it would have continued to smoulder and expand in an ever-widening circle. And that thought led to another of much greater significance. The shot had been fired at close range to ensure accuracy of aim or deaden the sound of the report, but whichever the murderer's intention, the second purpose had been achieved, intentionally or unintentionally. How had it happened, then, that the sound of the report had penetrated so loudly downstairs? As Colwyn moved about the room, examining everything with his quick appraising eye, he noticed that the position of the bed had been changed since he last saw it. The head was a trifle askew, and nearer to the side of the wall than the foot. The difference was slight, but Colwyn could see a portion of the fireplace which had not been visible before. The bed stood almost in the centre of the room, the foot in line with the door, and the head about 3 or 4 feet from the chimney-piece. In noting this rather unusual position during his last visit, Colwyn had formed the conclusion that it had been chosen for the benefit of fresh air and light during the summer months, as the window which looked over the terraced gardens was nearer that end of the room. Colwyn approached the head of the bed and bent down to examine the bedposts. A slight groove in the deep pile carpet showed clearly enough that the bed had been pushed back a few inches. The change in position was so trifling that it might have been attributed to the act of a servant in sweeping the room, if a closer examination had not revealed the continuance of the groove under the bed. The inference was unmistakable. The bed, in the first instance, had been pushed back much farther on its casters, and then almost, but not quite, restored to its original position. Had the bed been moved to gain access to the fireplace? He could see no reason for such a proceeding. It was too early in the autumn to need fires, and the room had not been occupied since the murder. In any case, the appearance of the grate showed that no fire had been lit. There was ample space to pass between the head of the bed and the fireplace, though perhaps not much room for movement. On his last visit, Colwyn had looked into this space to test its possibilities of concealment. In the quickened interest of his new discovery, he pushed the bed out of the way and examined it again. The first thing that caught his eye was a scratch on the polished surface of the register grate. It looked to be of recent origin, and for that reason suggested to Colwyn's mind that the bed had been moved by somebody who wanted more room in front of the grate. For what purpose? He turned his attention to the grate itself in the hope of obtaining an answer to that question. The grate was empty, and in the housewifely way a sheet of white paper had been laid on the bottom bars to catch occasional flakes of soot from the chimney. But there were no burnt papers or charred fragments to suggest that the grate had recently been used. Dissatisfied and perplexed, Colwyn was about to rise to his feet, when it chanced that his eyes, glancing into a corner, lighted on something tiny and metallic in the crevice between the white paper and the side bars of the grate. Wondering what it was, he succeeded in getting it out with his finger and thumb. It was a percussion cap. This discovery, strange as it was, seemed at first sight far enough removed from the circumstances of the murder, except so far as it brought the thought of lethal weapons to the imagination. But a weapon which required a percussion cap for its discharge had nothing to do with Violet Heredith's death. She had been killed by a bullet which fitted Nepcote's revolver, which was a pinfire weapon. The medical evidence had established that fact beyond the shadow of a doubt. Moreover, the percussion cap was unexploded, which seemed to make its presence in the grate even more difficult of explanation. It looked as though it had been dropped accidentally, but how came it to be there at all? The strangeness of the discovery was intensified by the knowledge that percussion caps and muzzle-loading weapons had become antiquated with the advent of the breech-loader. Who used such things nowadays? By the prompting of that mysterious association of ideas which is called memory, Colwyn was reminded of his earlier visit to the gun-room downstairs, and Musard's statement about the famous pair of pistols in the brass-bound mahogany box, which carried as true as a rifle up to 50 yards, but had a heavy recoil. They belonged to the period between breech-loaders and the ancient flintlocks, and were probably muzzle-loaders. With that sudden recollection, Colwyn also recalled that Musard had been unable to show him the pistols because the key of the case had been mislaid or lost. This incident, insignificant as it had appeared at the time, seemed hardly to gain in importance when considered in conjunction with the discovery of the cap in the grate. Apart from the stimulus to memory the percussion cap had produced, there was no visible coordination between the two facts, because it was, apparently, quite certain that Mrs. Heredith had been shot by Nepcote's revolver, and by no other weapon. But the balance of probabilities in crime are sometimes turned by apparently irrelevant trifles which assume importance on investigation. Was it possible that the key of the pistol case had been deliberately concealed, because the box had something to hide which formed a connection between the pistols and the presence of the cap in the grate? That inference could only be tested by an examination of the case of pistols. The experiment was undoubtedly worth trying. Colwyn left the room and descended the stairs. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of The Hand in the Dark. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Hand in the Dark by Arthur J. Rees. Chapter 27. The gun-room was dark and silent as a vault. In the deep recesses the armoured phantoms of dead-and-gone Heredith seemed to be watching the intruder with hidden eyes behind the bars of their tilting helmets and visored salades. The light of Colwyn's electric torch fell on the shell of a mighty warrior who stood with one steel gauntlet raised as though in readiness to defend the honour of his house. His initials, P.H., were engraved on his giant steel breast, and his steel heels flourished a pair of fearful spurs with rowels like daggers. Standing by this giant was a tiny suit of armour, not more than 3 feet in height, which might have been worn by a child. "A strange pair," murmured Colwyn, pausing a moment to glance at them. As he turned his light in their direction, his eye was caught by an inscription cut in the stone above their heads, and he drew nearer and read that the large suit had been worn by the former Philip Heredith, a true knight of God. The smaller suit had been made for a dwarf attached to his house, who had followed his master through the Crusades and fought gallantly by his side. Colwyn turned away and flashed his light along the walls in search of the case of pistols. His torch glanced over the numerous trophies adorning the walls: lances, swords, daggers, steel headpieces, bassinets, peaked morions, relics of a departed age of chivalry, when knights quarrelled prettily for ladies and fighting was fair and open, before civilization had enriched warfare with the Christian attributes of gas shells, liquid fire, and high explosives. Then the light fell on that which he was seeking, a dark oblong box with brass corners and a brass handle closing into the lid. Colwyn lifted the case down from the embrasure in which it was placed, and carried it to the bagatelle table. A brief examination of the lock satisfied him that it was too complicated and strong to be picked or broken. It was curiously wrought in brass, of an intricate antique pattern which would have puzzled a modern locksmith. He turned the case over, and saw that the bottom had been mortised and screwed. The screws had been deeply countersunk and were embedded in rust, but a few were loose with age. Colwyn unscrewed these loose ones with his pocket-knife, and then set about unloosening the others. It was a tedious task, but Colwyn lightened it with the aid of a bottle of gun oil which he found in one of the presses. Some of the screws yielded immediately to that bland influence and came out easily. Others remained fast in the intractable way of rusty screws, but Colwyn persevered, and by dint of oiling, coaxing, and unscrewing, finally had the satisfaction of seeing all the screws lying in a little greasy brown heap on the faded green cloth of the bagatelle table. The next thing was to lever off the bottom of the lid. That was not difficult, because the glue in the mortices had long since perished. Soon the bottom was lying on the table beside the screws, and the interior of the case revealed. The pair of weapons which Colwyn lifted from the case were horse pistols of a period when country folk feared to ride abroad without some such protection against highwaymen. They were superior specimens of their type. They were beautifully made, rich in design and solid in form, with ebony stocks and chased silver mountings. The long barrels were damascened, and the carved handles terminated in flat steel butts which would have cracked the pate of any highwayman if the shot missed fire. As Colwyn anticipated, the pistols were muzzle-loaders. The cock, which laid over considerably, was in the curious form of a twisted snake. When the trigger was pulled, the head of the snake fell on the nipple. Colwyn examined them carefully. He first ascertained that they were unloaded by probing them with the ramrod which was attached to each by a steel hinge. Then he ran his finger round the inside of the muzzles to ascertain whether either pistol had been recently fired. One was clean, but from the muzzle of the other he withdrew a finger grimed with gunpowder. While he was doing this, his other hand came in contact with something slightly uneven in the smooth metal surface of the butt. He turned the pistol over, and noticed a small inner circle in the flat steel. It was a small hinged lid which hid a pocket in the handle. He raised the little lid with his fingernail, and a shower of percussion caps fell on the bagatelle table. This contrivance for holding caps was not new to Colwyn. He had seen it in other old-fashioned muzzle-loaders. Colwyn compared the caps which had dropped on the table with the one he had found upstairs. They were the same size. He tried the solitary cap on the nipple and found that it fitted perfectly. As he did so, he saw something resembling a thread of yellow wool caught in the twisted steel of the hammer. It was a minute fragment, so small as to be hardly noticeable. Colwyn was quite unable to determine what it was, but its presence there puzzled him considerably, and he was at a loss to understand how it had got caught in the hammer of the pistol. It struck him that the thread might be khaki, and his mind reverted to his earlier discovery of the patch of khaki in the wood outside the moat house. It was with the hope of finding out whether this pistol had been lately used that Colwyn turned his attention to the velvet-lined interior of the case. The inside was divided into a large compartment for the pistols and several small lidded spaces. In one of these he found some shot, a box of percussion caps, and a powder flask half full of common gunpowder. Another space contained implements for cleaning the pistols. The contents of the next compartment puzzled him. There were some odd lengths of knotted string and a coil of yellow tubular fabric about the thickness of his little finger, some inches in length. Colwyn recognized it at once. It was the wick of a tinder lighter, then being sold by thousands of English tobacconists to replace a wartime scarcity of matches, and greatly used by cigarette smokers. The mystery of the presence of the wick in the pistol case was not lessened because it enabled Colwyn to identify the tiny yellow fragment adhering to the cock of the pistol. He picked up the wick and observed that one end was cut clean, but the other end was blackened and burnt. At that discovery there entered his mind the first prescient warning of the possibility of some deep plan in which the pistol and the wick played important parts. With his brain seeking for a solution of that possibility, he proceeded to examine the pieces of string. They were odd lengths of ordinary thick twine, but they all seemed to consist of loose ends which had been knotted together. It was not until Colwyn took them out of the compartment that he noticed an amazing peculiarity about them. Each piece of knotted string was burnt at both ends. There are some discoveries which spring into the mind with shattering swiftness. This was one of them. A revelation seemed to come to Colwyn as light from the sky at midnight, which lays everything bare in one frightful flash. "Is it possible?" He felt as though these words rushed from him like a thunder roll reverberating through the empty space around him. But his set lips had not uttered a single sound. With tingling nerves he proceeded to carry out an experiment. He first laid the wick of the tinder lighter along the stock of the pistol, just behind the hammer. He next took up one of the lengths of string, and pulling back the hammer and the trigger of the pistol, proceeded to bind them both firmly back with the string, which he passed twice round the wick. When he had tied the string tight, he lit a match and applied it to the end of the wick which was farthest from the string. His idea was to see whether this extemporized fuse would creep along the stock of the pistol, burn the string, and release the bound cock and trigger. The wick smouldered and glowed and began to creep towards the string, which crossed the stock of the pistol about 3 inches from the burning end. Colwyn took out his watch and timed its progress. In 4 minutes the first inch of the wick was consumed, and the spark at the end continued to creep sullenly forward in a dull red glow. In another 8 minutes it reached the string, and Colwyn eagerly watched the progress of the burning of the binding. The string singed, smouldered, and when nearly severed, sprang apart under the pressure of the hammer and trigger it had been holding back. The released hammer fell with full force on the cap on the nipple and exploded it. There then seemed the explanation. Mrs. Heredith had been shot with Nepcote's revolver, but it was not the deliberately deadened sound of that slight weapon which had startled the guests in the dining room on the night of the murder. The report they had heard was made by the heavier pistol in front of him. It was a ruse of terrifying simplicity but diabolical ingenuity. The wick of the tinder lighter was an admirable slow match, obtainable in any tobacconist's shop for a few pence, which, by means of this trick, had established a false alibi for the actual murderer, by causing the report which had reached the dining room and sent the inmates hastening upstairs to ascertain the cause. The shot which had mortally wounded Mrs. Heredith must have been fired before. How long before? Obviously not very long. That would have been dangerous to the murderer's plans. He had to consider 2 things. There was the chance of somebody entering the room before the false charge exploded, and the possibility that the coldness of the body of his victim might arouse medical suspicions. Colwyn did not think that the criminal had avoided killing Mrs. Heredith so as to ensure against that risk of discovery. The infliction of a mortal wound which failed to cause immediate death not only required a high degree of anatomical knowledge, but left the door open to a dying confession which might have upset the whole plan. Fate had helped the murderer to that extent. But the murderer owed more than that to fate. It was to that grim goddess he was indebted for the last wonderful touch of actuality which lifted the whole contrivance so superbly above the realm of artifice. Suspicion was in the last degree unlikely in any case, but Hazel Rath's entry and loud scream, just before the moment fixed for the explosion, ensured complete success by adding a natural verisimilitude which might have deceived the very spirit of truth. Colwyn esteemed himself fortunate indeed in lighting on what he believed to be the facts. Who could have imagined a situation in which whimsical destiny had ironically stooped down from her high place to dabble ignobly in a murderer's ghastly plot? The one point which perplexed Colwyn was the successful concealment of the pistol on the night of the murder. That part of the plan was as essential to the murderer as the false report, but it seemed strange that the pistol had not been discovered when the room was searched. An examination of the grate upstairs might reveal the reason. Before leaving the gun room, Colwyn replaced one of the pistols and restored the case as he had found it in its original position. He carried away with him the pistol which had been used. When he reached the upstairs bedroom, he locked the door before proceeding to examine the fireplace. It was immediately apparent to him that the pistol had not been placed in the grate or beneath it. Either place would have meant discovery when the room was searched. It was a careful examination of the upper portion of the grate which suggested the hiding place. The weapon could have been safely hidden within the broad iron flange running round the open damper of the grate. The complete revelation of this portion of the murderer's design came to Colwyn as he was passing his hand over the inner surface of this ledge. It was a register grate, and the space at the back had not been filled in. The murderer, when concealing the pistol at the top of the grate, had only to balance it carefully on the flange, with the muzzle pointing into the room, to ensure that the recoil from the report would cause the weapon to fall into the deep hole between the back of the grate and the chimney. This additional proof of the murderer's perverted intelligence impressed Colwyn as much as the mechanism for the false report. The pistol, blindly recoiling and jumping behind the grate after the explosion of the blank charge, was almost as effectually concealed as at the bottom of the sea, and might have remained there for years without discovery. Colwyn plunged his arm into the hole, but could not reach the bottom. But the murderer had more in his mind than the effectual concealment of the pistol, important though that was to him. The grate was an excellent choice for two other reasons. It carried the slight vapour from the tinder wick up the chimney, and the convex iron interior formed an excellent sounding board which would enhance the sound of the report. Truly, the dark being who had planned it all had left nothing to chance. He had foreseen everything. His handiwork bore the stamp of unholy genius. Who had done this thing? Who had sought, with such patient cunning, to upset those evidential principles by which blind justice gropes her hesitating way to truth? In concocting his masterpiece of malignant ingenuity, the murderer had worked alone. His only accomplice, apart from the after hand of fate, was a piece of automatic mechanism which had done his bidding secretly and would never have betrayed him. It was this ability to work alone, scheming and brooding in solitary concentration until the whole of the horrible conception had been perfected in every degree, which stamped the designer as a ferocious criminal of unusual mould, remorseless as a tiger, with a neurasthenic mind swayed by the unbridled savagery of natural impulse. As Colwyn meditated over the murder, his original impression of the guests assembled in the dining-room downstairs in a premeditated scene set for its production came back to him with renewed force. The murderer had taken his part in that scene as one of the unconscious audience, dining and taking his share in the conversation, while his secret consciousness was strained to an intense anticipation of the false signal from his mechanical accomplice upstairs. Colwyn could picture him joining in the mockery of meaningless phrases, with dry lips, his ears listening for every sound, his eyes covertly watching the crawling hands of the clock. Then, when the crack had pealed forth, he had been able to exchange suspense for action, and rush upstairs with the others, confident in the feeling that, let suspicion point where it would, it could not fall on him. But the murderer had not foreseen the scream which preceded the shot. How had he comported himself under the shock of that cry, which was outside the region of his calculations? He had not time to reflect upon its origin, to investigate its source. He had to steel his nerves to face it, because he dared not do otherwise. But its sudden effect on the nerve centres of his brain, previously strained almost to the breaking point, must have brought him to the verge of a subsequent collapse. Colwyn believed he saw the end in sight. The presumptions, the facts, and the motive all pointed to one figure as the murderer of Violet Heredith. She had been killed from the dual motive of punishment in her own case, and vengeance on a greater offender than herself. The alibi had been devised to ensure a tremendous revenge on the man by bringing him to the gallows as her supposed murderer. That part of the plan had gone astray, so the murderer, in the fanatical resolve of his latent fixed idea, had recourse to a further expedient as daring and original as the scheme which failed. The second instrument had been the means of his own undoing. But as he reached this final stage of his reasoning, Colwyn stopped short in something like dismay. He had left a point of vital importance out of his calculations. If the murderer was the man he thought, he was downstairs in the dining room at the time the false shot was fired. Then whose hand had clutched Hazel Rath's throat in the murdered woman's bedroom upstairs just before the shot was fired? Colwyn slowly paced up and down the room in the midnight silence, conning all the facts over again in the light of this overlooked incident. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of The Hand in the Dark. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Hand in the Dark by Arthur J. Rees. Chapter 28. The three dined together in the big dining room, almost in silence. Musard and Philip Heredith had not returned until after 6, and their first knowledge of Colwyn's presence was by some oversight deferred until they met at the dinner table. In the awkwardness of that surprise they sat down to dine, and Musard's half-hearted efforts to start a conversation met with little response from his companions. Colwyn was preoccupied with his own thoughts, which apparently affected his appetite, for he sent away dish after dish untouched. Phil hastened the service of the meal considerably, as though he were anxious to get it over as speedily as possible, in order to hear what the detective had to say. As soon as the dessert was on the table, he turned to Colwyn eagerly, and asked him if he had any news. "I have many things to say," was the response. "In that case, shall we take our coffee into the smoking-room?" suggested Musard, with a slight glance at the hovering figure of the butler. "I prefer to remain here, if you do not mind," said Colwyn. Musard shot a puzzled look at him, which the detective met with a clear, cold gaze which revealed nothing. There was another silent pause while they waited for the butler to leave the room, but Tufnell was pouring out coffee and handing cigars with the slow deliberation of a man sufficiently old to have outlived any illusions about the value of time. Philip Heredith lit a cigarette. Musard waved away the cigar-box and produced a strong black cheroot from the crocodile-skin case. Colwyn declined a cigar, and his coffee remained untasted in front of him. "You can leave the room now, Tufnell," said Phil impatiently. "Do not return until I ring. We do not wish to be disturbed." Tufnell bowed and left the room. As he did so, Colwyn pushed back his chair and walked across to the window, where he stood for a few moments looking out. A wan young moon gleamed through the black tapestry of the avenue of trees, pointing white fingers at the house and plunging the old garden into deep pools of shadow. The trees huddled in their rows, whispering menacingly, and stretching half-stripped branches to the silent sky. Colwyn returned to the table and confronted the two men who were awaiting him. He glanced from one to the other of their attentive faces, and said abruptly, "Hazel Rath is innocent." "I was certain of it." Philip Heredith's hand came down emphatically on the table in front of him as he made this declaration. "I knew it all along," he added in additional emphasis. "This is an amazing piece of news, Mr. Colwyn," said Musard, turning earnestly to the detective. "Who, then—" Colwyn made a detaining gesture. "Wait," he said. "I cannot tell you that just yet." He turned to Phil, whose dark eyes were fixed on his face. "It was you who asked me to try and solve the mystery of your wife's death. It is to you that my explanation is due. Shall I speak freely in Mr. Musard's presence, or would you rather hear me alone?" "I can go to the smoking-room," said Musard, rising as he spoke. But Phil waved him to his seat again. "No, no, Musard, stay where you are. There is no reason why you should not hear what Mr. Colwyn has to say. Your advice may be needed," he added as an afterthought. "So be it," said Colwyn. "Then I had better commence by informing you that Hazel Rath has broken her silence. She has made a statement to the police which, whilst affirming her innocence, does very little to clear up the murder. Her story, briefly, is that she went up to the left wing about 7:30, noticed that Mrs. Heredith's room was in darkness, and went in under the impression that she might be ill and in need of assistance. She groped her way across the room to turn on the light, and she had reached the head of the bed and was feeling for the switch when a hand clutched her throat. She screamed wildly, and the hand fell away. A moment afterwards the report of a shot filled the room. She found the electric switch and turned on the light. The first thing she saw was a revolver, Nepcote's revolver, lying at her feet near the head of the bed. Then her eyes turned to the bed, and she saw Mrs. Heredith bleeding from the mouth and nose. While she was attempting to render her some assistance, she heard footsteps on the stairs, and thought of her own safety. She switched off the light and ran out, carrying the revolver and the handkerchief with which she had been wiping the blood from the dying woman's lips. She was just in time to conceal herself behind the curtains in the corridor and escape the observation of those who were rushing upstairs. There she stayed while the rooms were searched, and was afterwards able to steal downstairs unobserved and gain the safety of her mother's apartments, where the revolver and the handkerchief were subsequently found. "This is a remarkable story," said Musard slowly. "Do the police believe it?" "They do not, but I have my reasons for thinking it is true," responded Colwyn. "The next step in the story of how this unhappy girl became the victim of an apparently irrebuttable set of circumstances through her own silence has to do with another person's secret visit to the moat house on the night of the murder. That person was a man who came to return to Mrs. Heredith the necklace which we subsequently discovered to be missing from her locked jewel case. It is not necessary to relate how the necklace came to be in his hands. He had undertaken to return the necklace from London to enable Mrs. Heredith to produce it on the following day, and it was arranged between them that when he reached the moat house that night he was to enter the unused door in the left wing, which was to be previously unlocked for him, and was to wait on the staircase until Mrs. Heredith was able to steal down to him and obtain the jewels. That plan was upset by Tufnell finding the door unlocked and locking it again before his arrival. When he did arrive he found himself unable to get in. "Stop a moment," exclaimed Musard hoarsely. "This story goes too deep for me. Who is this man? Do you know him? Has he anything to do with the murder?" "Yes, I know him, and he has much to do with the murder," said the detective. "Shall I mention his name, Mr. Heredith?" Phil nodded as though he were unable to speak. "The man is Captain Nepcote." "Nepcote!" A swift flash of wrath came into Musard's heavy dark eyes as he uttered the name. Then, in a wider understanding of the sordid interpretation of Colwyn's story, he hesitatingly added, "I think I see. It was Nepcote's revolver. Was it he who shot Violet?" Before answering that question, it is necessary to give Nepcote's explanation of his actions on that night. His own story is that he did not enter the house. He says that while he was waiting outside he heard a scream, followed by a shot, and he then hid in the woods in front of the house until he thought it safe to return to London. He declares he is innocent of the murder. "That is a lie!" Phil burst forth. "Who will believe him?" He stopped abruptly and turned fiercely to Colwyn. "How do you know Nepcote said this?" he demanded. "Because I saw him the night before I left London. He told me everything, and gave me the necklace." "And you let him go again? Are you mad?" Phil was on his feet, shaking with excitement. "What makes you think I let him go?" retorted Colwyn coldly. "You need not be afraid that your wife's murderer will escape justice. Nepcote is lying ill of pneumonia in a private hospital in London. He can only escape by death. But the manner in which you have received this information suggests to my mind that you have had your own suspicions of Nepcote all along, but have kept them to yourself." "I cannot conceive that to be any business of yours," replied the young man, with a touch of hauteur. "It seems to me that it is, in the circumstances. You came to me seeking my assistance because you believed in the innocence of Hazel Rath, but, as I am now convinced, you suppressed information which pointed to Captain Nepcote." "I told you all that I thought necessary. You told me that your wife had been shot with Nepcote's revolver. Is that what you mean?" "Yes, that was sufficient to put you on the track without taking you into my confidence about something which affected my honour and the honour of my family." Phil turned very pale as he uttered the last words. "Perhaps Phil should have told you, but you must make commenced Musard, but Colwyn silenced him with an imperative glance. "At the time you came to see me you believed that Captain Nepcote had murdered your wife?" he said, facing Phil. "I did." "Do you mind telling me now on what ground you based that belief?" "I fail to recognize your right to cross-question me," replied the young man haughtily. "But I will answer your question. It was for the reason that you supposed. I suspected his relations with my wife. There was his revolver to prove that he had been in her room. I do not know why Hazel Rath carried it away." "Perhaps I could enlighten you on that point. As you knew so much, it is equally certain that you knew about your wife's missing necklace, though you did not tell me of that either. But I will not go into that now. I wish to hurry on to my conclusion. I have at least done all that you asked me to do. I have proved Hazel Rath's innocence. But I have proved more than that. Captain Nepcote is also innocent." "I should like to hear how you arrive at that conclusion." Phil strove to utter the words calmly, but his trembling lips revealed his inward agitation. "His story, as told to me, fits in with facts of which he could have had no knowledge. He says he found the door of the left wing locked, and we know it was locked by Tufnell more than an hour before. He states that after the shot he hid in the woods in front of the house. It was there Tufnell thought he saw somebody hiding. It was there I found a scrap of khaki adhering to a bramble at the spot indicated by Nepcote as his hiding place. Tufnell admits that he called out in alarm when his eye fell on the crouching figure. Nepcote says that he saw Tufnell, heard his cry, and plunged deeper into the bushes for safety. Tufnell returned along the carriage drive 20 minutes afterwards with Detective Caldew and Sergeant Lumb. Nepcote heard the crunch of their feet on the gravel as they passed. His accuracy in these details, which he could not possibly have known, helped me to the conclusion that the whole of his story was true." "He had plenty of time to commit the murder, nevertheless," said Phil. "It is useless for you to try and cling to that theory now." There was something in the tone in which these words were uttered which caused the young man to look swiftly at the detective from beneath furrowed brows. "You seem to have constituted yourself the champion of this scoundrel," he said, in a changed, harsh voice. Musard glanced from one to the other with troubled eyes. There was a growing hint of menace in their conversation which his mind, deeply agitated by the strange disclosures of the evening, could only fear without fathoming. "I do not understand you," he said simply, addressing himself to Colwyn. "If this man Nepcote did not commit the murder, who did? Was it not he who was in the bedroom when Hazel Rath went there in the dark?" "No," said Colwyn, "it was not he." "Who was the man, then, who clutched Hazel Rath by the throat?" persisted Musard. "It was no man," responded Colwyn in a gloomy voice. "That was the point which baffled me for hours when I thought the whole truth was within my grasp. Again and again I sought vainly for the answer, until, in mental weariness and utter despair, I was tempted to believe that the powers of evil had combined to shield the perpetrator of this atrocious murder from justice. Then it came to me, the last horrible revelation in this hellish plot. It was the hand of the dying woman, spasmodically clutching at the empty air in her death agonies, which accidentally came in contact with Hazel Rath's throat and loosened her brooch. "Oh, this is too terrible," murmured Musard. His swarthy face showed an ashen tint. "What do you mean? What are you keeping back? Where does all this lead to?" "It leads to the exposure of the trick of the false report by which the murderer sought to procure an alibi and revenge." "What do you mean? What have you found out?" cried Phil, leaping to his feet and facing Colwyn. As he uttered the words, a loud shot in the room overhead rang out with startling distinctness. "I mean that," said Colwyn quietly. Even up to the moment of his experiment he was not quite certain, but in the one swift glance they exchanged everything was revealed to each of them. Before Musard could frame the question which trembled on his amazed lips, Phil spoke. His face was very white, and his dark eyes blazing. "Yes, that is it. You have found me out." His voice, deepened to a bitter intensity, had a deliberate intonation which was almost solemn. "What did they do to me? Shall I ever forget my feelings when, unobserved by them, I caught them in the house one day, whispering and kissing? I walked straight out into the woods to be alone with my shame. My brain was on fire when I recalled his lecherous looks and her wanton, meaning glances. I was tempted to destroy myself in misery and despair. Human nature! Ah, God, what a beastly thing it is! I had trusted them both so utterly. I loved her so deeply. How had they repaid my trust and love? By deceiving me under my eyes, in my own home, before my marriage was 3 months old. That night I dreamt of obscene things. I awoke with their images hovering by my bedside, looking at me with sneering eyes, mocking me with lewd gestures. "Your honour and the honour of the Herediths. Where is it?" they kept repeating. "Sold by the wanton you have made your wife. What is honour to the lust of the flesh? There is nothing so strong in the world." But as I watched them the ceiling rolled away, and in the darkness of the sky a stern and implacable face appeared. And it said, "There is one thing stronger than honour, stronger even than the lust of the flesh, and that is death." It was the answer to a question I had been asking myself ever since I knew. I got up and sat by the open window to plan how I should kill them both. But I wanted the man to feel more than a swift thunderstroke of mortal agony. I wished to make him suffer as I had suffered. But at first I could see no way. Then it came to me in the strangest way. A light, a direction, a guide. I had been smoking as I sat there thinking, smoking cigarettes which I lit with a little automatic lighter I always used. I must have laid it down carelessly, for I was interrupted in my meditations by the sight of a thin trail of vapour ascending from the window ledge. I had failed to put the extinguisher on the lighter, and the wick had gone on burning. As I watched the red spark crawling almost imperceptibly along the yellow wick, there dawned in my mind the first glimmering of the idea of a slow match and a delayed report. Bit by bit it took form, and the means of my revenge was made clear to me. I went back to bed and slept soundly. I was in no hurry to act. There was much to think over, much to do, before the plan was finally perfected. I carried out experiments in the gun-room when everybody was in bed, secure in the knowledge that no report, however loud, could penetrate from those thick walls upstairs. While I was making ready, I watched them both. Not a furtive glance or caress passed between them which I did not see. The night my aunt asked Violet about the necklace, I suspected that it was no longer in her possession. I guessed that by her evasive answers and telltale face. When she left the room and went upstairs, I crept after her in the shadows and followed her to the door of Nepcote's room. I listened to their conversation. I heard him promise her to return secretly to the moat house on the following night with the necklace. My heart leapt as I listened. I believed that I had him. I stole away quietly without waiting to learn any more, but I stayed up till far into the night preparing my final plans. My intention was to shoot her just before dinner and arrange for the false report to explode after he had arrived and hidden himself in the old staircase, waiting for her to go to him. Then, when the report startled everybody in the dining room, I intended to be the first to rush upstairs and lead the search in the direction of the old staircase. I would have had him by the throat before he had time to get away. How would he have been able to account for his secret presence in the house when her jewels were in his pocket and her dead body upstairs, close to where he was hiding? I had intended to kill Violet with a small revolver which I had bought in a second-hand place at London last winter, but Nepcote's carelessness in leaving his own revolver in the gun-room gave the last finishing touch to my plan. I could scarcely believe my luck when I found it. It seemed as though he himself were playing into my hands. I hid it away, expecting that there would be inquiries, but there were none. He had forgotten all about it. It was strange, too, that Violet herself helped by telling my aunt before dinner on the night of her pretended illness that she did not wish to be disturbed by anybody. That removed a defect in my arrangements which had caused me much anxious thought. I had feared that somebody, probably a servant, might enter the room in the period between the first and second reports. It was a chance I could not afford to overlook, and I could see no way of guarding against it except by locking the door, which I did not want to do. I wanted to leave the door partly open so as to make sure of the second report penetrating to the dining room downstairs. When my aunt gave me Violet's message in the library shortly before dinner, I knew that the moment had arrived. The altered arrangements for an earlier dinner cost me a moment's perplexity, but no more. One cannot hurry one's own guests, and I knew it would be impossible to get dinner over as quickly as my aunt anticipated. If it were ending too quickly for my purpose, it would be an easy matter to introduce a subject which would set somebody talking. That, as you know, is what actually happened. After my aunt left me, I waited until the last possible moment before slipping upstairs. The revolver and the pistol were locked away in my own bedroom in readiness. I got them out. The pistol was completely prepared except for the cap. I had bound a 12-inch tinder wick to the stock in order to allow for a delay of nearly 50 minutes between the lighting and the report. I knew that Nepcote expected to arrive at the moat house by 7:30 at the latest, but I gave him a margin of a few minutes for unexpected delays. I put the pistol in my pocket, and wrapping the revolver in a silk muffler to deaden the report, went swiftly to my wife's room. I closed the door behind me as I entered. She was lying on the bed with her eyes closed, and did not hear me approach. That helped me. Can you understand my feelings? I was about to destroy something I loved better than life itself, but it was not she who was lying on the bed. She had died before, died by her own act, leaving behind her another woman whose life was a living lie, who was so corrupt and worthless as to be unfit to live. It was that I was going to destroy. I felt no compunction, no remorse. As I placed the muzzle of the revolver against her breast, she opened her eyes in terror and saw me. I pulled the trigger quickly. As I did so, I heard the dinner gong downstairs. The muffled report made less noise than the clapping of a pair of hands. I knew that faint sound would not be heard downstairs. She never moved, and I thought she was dead. I bent over the fireplace, shook some caps out of the butt of the pistol, and placed one on the nipple. Then I lit a match and started my prepared fuse. It was an easy matter to place the pistol in position at the top of the grate. The difficulty of recovering it subsequently was not made manifest to me until after my illness, although my previous secret examination of the grate had convinced me that the recoil of the explosion would cause the pistol to fall to the bottom of the chimney behind the grate. When I had placed the pistol in position, I turned off the electric light and opened the window to allow the fumes of the burning wick to escape. Then I hurried downstairs. I was not in the room 3 minutes altogether. I saw nobody on my way down. Nearly everybody had gone in to dinner, but I was in time to sit down with the others. I felt quite cold and collected as I sat at the dinner table waiting for the moment of my vengeance. I felt as though I was under the control of some force immensely stronger than myself, which held me firm with giant hands while the minutes slowly ebbed away. I am sure there was nothing unusual in my behaviour. I pretended to eat, and joined in the conversation around me. The report did not come at the moment I anticipated, but I was not perturbed at the delay. My experiments had taught me the difficulty of fixing an explosion for an exact period. The time was in general approximately the same, but there were reasons which caused a slight difference. The wick always burnt at a uniform rate. The trouble was with the string. Sometimes it was slow in catching. Sometimes the pressure of the string partly extinguished the wick and made combustion slower as it neared the point of contact. Once I tied the string so tight that the wick went out altogether just before reaching the string. But I had taken measures to overcome these little irregularities, and to make sure of the string catching readily, I had rubbed a little petrol on it where it crossed the wick. But it was the scream before the report which upset my calculations and almost caused me to collapse. When that terrible cry rang out, my false strength fled from me, leaving me weak and trembling. I think I should have betrayed myself if the report had not followed so quickly, throwing everybody into the same state of confusion as myself. I do not know how I managed to make my limbs carry me upstairs with the others. I did not know what had happened. My brain refused to act. I was conscious of nothing except that a great wheel seemed turning inside my head, tightening all my nerves to such taut agony that I could hardly refrain from crying aloud. What I said or did when I found myself in the bedroom I do not know. When I saw that everything was as I had arranged, my mind began swinging like a pendulum towards my revenge, and I struggled to lead the search towards the staircase. But I was unable to move. I was like a man in a dream, encompassed by invisible obstacles. Then the wheel in my head suddenly relaxed. I felt the room and its objects slipping from me, and everything went black. You know about my illness. It was not until I was supposed to be recovering that the power of clear thought came back to me. There were days when my brain was numb and powerless, like that of one newly awakened from a terrible nightmare, striving to recall what had happened. Then one day the veil was drawn, and I remembered everything. My aunt was in the room, and I questioned her. She brought Musard to me, and from him I learnt the truth. Intuitively I realized what had happened. Hazel Rath had gone to the room for some unknown reason, had seen my wife lying there, and screamed. Then, hardly conscious of what she was doing, she picked up the revolver I had left lying by the bedside, and ran out of the room in fright. I was even able to divine a reason for her silence under the accusation of murder. She felt that nobody would believe her story, especially after the history of her mother's past was brought to light. As I turned over what they had told me, and realized that my own secret was safe, I thought I saw the way to accomplish my revenge and save Hazel Rath. Up till then, the revolver had not been identified as Nepcote's. It seemed to me that the mere disclosure of that fact was sufficient to direct attention to Nepcote and bring to light his movements on that night. But the detective who came to see me about the revolver was too foolish and obstinate to grasp the importance of my information. It was then I decided to go to you. It was daring, perhaps, but it seemed safe enough to me. I was determined to entangle Nepcote and to free Hazel Rath. I told you no more than I had told to the other detective. I had powerful motives for reticence. If I had told you more, you would have seen that I had an ulterior reason for directing attention to Nepcote. I had not the least fear that you would discover my secret, but the knowledge, if imparted to you, would have weakened the impression I wanted to convey by suggesting to your mind that I was actuated by hatred of Nepcote. Besides, I did not wish any living being to know of my shame. I believed that I could accomplish my revenge without its ever being known. I thought Nepcote would prefer to perish as the victim of circumstances rather than incur public opprobrium by a defence which he knew would never be believed. The actual facts against him were too strong. He could neither extenuate nor deny them. He could not explain his lying telegrams, his secret return, his presence in the moat house, his possession of the necklace, the revolver in the bedroom where the body was. Therefore it was only necessary to give you a starting point, because discovery was inevitable where so much was hidden. I saw to it that the loss of the necklace was discovered after your arrival. That was all you needed to know. I do not know what oversight of mine put you on the track of the truth. There was one, but I do not see how that could have helped you. It was not until the following afternoon in the gun-room, when Musard drew your attention to the pistol case, that I remembered that the pistol I had used was still in the back of the fireplace upstairs, where apparently it had lain undiscovered during my illness. I had taken the precaution of concealing the key of the case, but I decided to restore the pistol that night after you left. It was more difficult to recover than I anticipated, owing to the depth of the space behind the grate. I had to push back the bedstead and use the tongs before I could reach it. I believe it would have lain there undiscovered for years. There was nothing else that I can recall, except that when I restored the pistol, I saw I had left the end of one of my experimental tinder lighter wicks lying in the case. But I do not wish to know how you found out, now that Nepcote has escaped. I have nothing left to live for. The doctor thinks I am recovering, but I knew that it was only the hope of revenge which kept me going. Now that is gone, I have not long to live. I rejoice that it is so. But whatever had happened, I would have saved that poor girl, Hazel Rath. I ask you to believe that. Violet. He ceased, and with a weary gesture let his head fall on his outstretched arms, as though the strength which bore him up while he told his tale deserted him when he had made manifest the truth. His two listeners sat for some minutes in silence, each engrossed in his own thoughts. Musard stared gloomily at Phil with unseeing eyes. He was as one who had passed through unimagined horrors in a space not to be measured by time, to emerge with a fatigued sense of the black malignity of unknown gods who create the passions of humanity for their own brutal sport. His moving lips betrayed a consciousness loosened from its moorings, tossed in a turbulent sea of disaster. Then they formed the whispered words, "The house was founded in horror, and it ends in horror. So the old tradition comes true." The next moment he turned his eyes on Colwyn with a look askance, as though he saw in him the instrument of this misery. "Why did Hazel Rath keep silence?" he asked. "Women have made greater sacrifices for love," Colwyn gently replied. "Hazel Rath loved him, and kept silence to shield him. She would not have spoken at all if suspicion had not fastened on Nepcote, and even when she did speak she kept something back. We may now learn later what actually passed between Hazel and Mrs. Heredith in the bedroom that night. My own opinion is that while Hazel Rath was bending over her, the dying woman whispered the name of her murderer. "What are you going to do now?" Musard abruptly demanded, in a sudden change of mood, speaking as though there were nobody present but their two selves. "There is only one thing to do." "Do you mean to let the world know the truth? To give him up to justice?" "What other course is there open for me to pursue?" said Colwyn sadly. "I cannot see what earthly purpose will be gained by making this horrible story public. Consider, I beg of you, all the circumstances before you inflict this dreadful sorrow and scandal on an honoured family." "It is because I have to consider all the circumstances that I have no option." "Is there no other way?" persisted Musard. "He is mad. He must have been possessed. You heard his story. His hallucinations were those of an insane person. He had some justification. He would never have committed this terrible deed of his own free will." Colwyn did not reply. It was useless to point out that there is no such thing as free will in human affairs, and that if Philip Heredith had been impelled to his crime by the evil force of passions which were stronger than the restraining power of human reason, he must pay the full price demanded by humanity for the only safeguard of its supremacy. There was the sound of an opening door and footsteps outside, and a voice called, Phil! Vincent! Where are you?" "They have returned!" Musard excitedly exclaimed. "What are they to be told?" "I cannot say," replied Colwyn, casting a sombre glance at Phil's drooping and motionless figure. There was something new in his posture, a stark stillness which arrested his eye. He stepped quickly to his side and bent over him. "He is dead," he said. "Dead? My God, impossible!" "It is quite true. It is better so." "Vincent!" Miss Heredith's voice sounded not far away. "She is coming here. Quick, what am I to say to her?" "I cannot tell you," responded Colwyn, with another glance at the still form. "It was he who called me in to solve this mystery, and I have done what he asked. I will leave you to tell her what you will, but I cannot keep silence afterwards where the liberty of innocent people is involved. Justice is as impersonal as truth herself." "Vincent?" This time the voice sounded just outside the door. "I must stop her. She must not come in here," said Musard, starting up. But he was too late. The door opened, and Miss Heredith stood in the doorway. Her startled eyes took in the agitated face of Musard, and then travelled to the drooping attitude of the figure at the table. She went quickly past the two men and bent over her nephew. As she did so, she sobbed aloud. All the pity and pathos of a woman, all the misery and mystery of a broken heart, welled forth in her faint, mournful cry. "This will kill her," said Musard savagely. But Colwyn felt that it would not be so. As he turned from the room, leaving the living and the dead together, he knew that when the first bitterness of the shock was over, and she was faced again with the consciousness of duty, she would call on her abiding faith to help her to wear, without flinching, the heavy grey garment of life. End of chapter 28. End of The Hand in the Dark by Arthur J. Rhys.